occupations, so segregation in that form, and also social and cultural segregation. That is to say, other caste communities within the same faith, within the same community, religious community, will not really interact much with them socially or culturally. And finally, they also suffer from economic discrimination because of their caste status. So people will not rent houses to them. They will not willingly enter into any sort of transaction unless it is absolutely necessary. So existing research on ethnographic research, other kinds of research accumulated over the decades, which we tracked down. Also, some surveys done by NGOs more recently all pointed to this, that they were treated differently. And common examples are separate seating in mosques and churches. Sometimes there are separate mosques themselves, separate churches definitely there are. And in mosques, there is often preferential seating for the so-called upper castes who are allowed to sit in front while performing namaz, and the ex-untouchable caste, the Dalit castes, have to be in the back. And in this form of visible humiliation or treatment as subordinate or subjugated groups. Another common example is separate burial grounds, where people from this community are not allowed to use the community burial grounds. The most strict prohibition, of course, is on marriage. And as is well known with other communities as well, other faith communities as well, sometimes these sanctions against intermarriage extend to what are called honor killings, where actually you might kill your own child or your own brother or sister because they were involved in a marriage with a person from this caste, even though they were from the same religion. And in general, an avoidance of interaction, social interaction with members of these castes. So in this way, their situation is not very different from that of Dalits in the communities that are already accorded reservation. And therefore, it is a case of, how shall I put it, moral inconsistency or moral dishonesty if we recognize and compensate for the discrimination against Dalits in one religious community, but don't do the same for similar discrimination in other religious communities. And in that sense, the non-extension of reservation to these communities should count as discriminatory in the sense of the Constitution. That is, that they are not being treated the same as other people who have got these benefits. The usual arguments given against this are that both these faiths don't recognize caste distinctions in their scriptures, in their original writings. But if we take that argument, the same is true of Sikhism and Buddhism as well, that no castes are recognized. In fact, Buddhism has a considerable reputation, at least in its formative years, in its early years of its spread, as an explicitly anti-caste religion that came up. Its spread was linked to protests against caste, the caste system as it existed at that time. So if reservation can be extended to Dalits in faiths like Sikhism and Buddhism, why not also to Muslims and Christians? The answer to this question, of course, lies in the extensive debate that took place in the Constituent Assembly around the whole question of reservation. And this is something I have been studying relatively recently. It's a very important and very interesting history that I think all of us should need to know more about. One way of summarizing that debate and its relevance for our present topic is to speak in terms of two things. One, during the Constituent Assembly, from the time that it starts in 1946 to the time that it comes to an end in 1948, 49, partition has happened in 1947. So the initial part of the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly and the later part, the pre-partition and post-partition deliberations, have understandably a very different flavor. They have a very different tenor, and they are in fact changed a lot. The terms of discussion get changed a lot. Everyone might be interested to know that in the draft Constitution of India, which was circulated to the Constituent Assembly in early 1948, around April, I think, 1948, the term used is minorities. That is to say, the term associated with reservation is minorities. And the depressed classes, as they were known then, the SCs and STs as they would be called today, are included under the minorities. And so are Muslims and Christians. and Sikhs, and I'm not sure about Buddhists, but definitely these communities are included. And there is a plan for making provisions for what are called safeguards, or in a different context, guarantees for them. But after, in the latter half of the Constituent Assembly's deliberations, the draft constitution is changed considerably by the time it becomes the final version that today we recognize as our constitution. And the word minorities gives place to another, a very important and very consequential word, the word backward. So the rationale for providing reservation shifts from providing it for vulnerable minorities, either politically vulnerable, like Muslims and Christians and so on, or socially vulnerable, like Dalits and Adivasis. So in this shift, and in the general, among the dominant sections of the, we must remember that the Constituent Assembly is not elected by universal franchise. It is a more or less semi-nominated and semi-elected based on a very partial franchise. So it is very heavily biased in favor of the already dominant sections of society at that time. This is something that has been mentioned as part of the debates themselves. So what is happening at this point is that the very idea of reservation is being shifted. It is being shifted from the language, the explicitly political language of equal representation and equal sharing of the nation, so to speak, among all communities in the future nation that is going to be formed, the republic that is going to be formed. There is a shift from that to the language of backwardness, and therefore a shift from an emphasis on discrimination to an emphasis on backwardness. And as part of this shift, the minorities, in terms of specifically the Muslims and Christians, get left out of this discussion. So at the time that the Constitution is passed in 1950, already some castes of Sikhs have already been included in that Constitution because of the insistence of their representatives in the Constituent Assembly. In 1956, the remaining Dalit castes amongst the Sikhs are included in the definition of the scheduled castes. And as we all know, in 1990, the Neo-Buddhists are also included. So in other words, the constitutional law on that deals with reservation has been amended at least twice, explicitly amended twice to accommodate newer groups. If that can be done, there is no reason why it cannot also be done for Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians. Finally, there is the language, or there is the argument of what are the practical implications if we were to do this. Sometimes the practical implications are what matter for politicians. So, for example, if the numbers involved were to be very large and that they would completely alter the character of reservation, then there would be an argument to consider this, even if in principle it was still wrong. There would be some pragmatic reason to say that making this change is going to be very difficult. It is going to create more difficulties and so on. But let us look at the numbers. Again, there is a different long story associated with the whole question of a caste census, which has been resisted very strongly over the past 3 decades by various governments, central governments. So we don't have an authoritative counting of castes, but except for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, on which we have very good data. But in the absence of data about caste in other than SCs and STs, and also, by the way, SCs and STs are counted only if they happen to be Hindus or Buddhists, or if they meet the definition. That is, Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists alone are counted. There is no religious bar of religion for scheduled tribe definition, so that is not an issue there. But in the case of the scheduled caste, there is this issue. So we have are guesstimates, just guesses and estimates made by scholars and others knowledgeable. And based on this, it looks like the proportion of Dalit castes among Muslims is actually, as a proportion, is very small. And again, I say we don't have authoritative figures, but roughly speaking, it is likely that their proportion will be less than 1% of Muslims, of the Muslim population. One, maybe just over one, around one, or maybe even less than one. We all know that the proportion of Dalits among Christians is much larger because of the pattern of conversion and the timing of conversion and so on. So if we take median estimates, somewhere between 50 and 60% of Christians might be. Some estimates are even higher, but if we are conservative, might be Dalits. So what we are talking about is 1% or less of about 14%. The population of Muslims in India is roughly 14%, little over 14%. And the population of Christians in India is 2.3%, little over 2.3%. So 60% of 2.4% and 1% of 14% is what we are talking about. Now, this amounts to less than 1% of India's population. And depending on how you estimate it, between 2 and 4% or so of the population of Dalits as such, scheduled castes as enumerated already. So in short, this is not going to be a huge number that is going to change things. And if the legal limitation of 50% on reservation was the argument, then as we all know, the EWS reservation judgment has torn up that argument, which is no longer available now. So in short, not providing reservation to Dalits among Muslims and Christians is unjust, it is irrational, and there are no practical or in principle reasons for not doing so. And therefore, the continuation of their being denied this constitutes, to my mind, an injustice which should be corrected as quickly as possible. I will stop here and wait for your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We have with us the chairperson for the session, Honorable Sachidanand Darunde. General Secretary of Maharashtra Officers Forum. I request sir to please felicitate Dr. Satish Deshpande with a memento and a bouquet online.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you. If I stand up, I'll go out of the picture. So I'll just namaskar and thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now I would request. Okay, we have with us one more speaker who is online, and so he's online with us, and we'll just change a bit our session. Okay, sorry sir. For Dr. Satish Deshpande sir, there are no questions sir, so you can leave. Thank you sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Okay, okay. So still Dr. Mohan Gopal is not available, so I would request the chairperson for this session, Honorable Sachidanand Darunde, to please sum up the session.
सर्वांना जय भीम. आजची ही जी नागपुरात आरक्षण परिषद होत आहे, एक चांगला प्रयत्न, एक चांगला मूवमेंटचा, एक चांगले चळवळीचा एक भाग म्हणून आपण या परिषदेकडे पाहायला हरकत नाही. थोरात सरांनी जो प्रयत्न केला सर्व संघटनांना एकत्र करायचा आणि या मार्फत ही रिझर्वेशन कॉन्फरन्स इथे आपण नागपुरात साजरी करत आहोत किंवा एक चांगला एक प्रयत्न करत आहोत, याला निश्चितच कुठे ना कुठे आपल्याला यश मिळणार आहे. अशी परिषद सर आपण महाराष्ट्र ऑफिसर फोरम 4-5 वर्ष अगोदर घेतली होती देशपांडे हॉलला, आणि त्यावेळेस विस्तृतपणे सुखदेव थोरात सरांनी आणि हरिनरके सरांनी चांगलं तिथे मार्गदर्शन केलं होतं, आणि त्यातल्या काही मुवमेंट आम्ही ते राबवले आहेत, त्या डायरेक्शनने आम्ही प्रयत्न केले आहेत. आता आजचा विषय जो होता आपला इथे की इश्यूज ऑफ दलित, मुस्लिम, ख्रिश्चन अँड बुद्धिस्ट. तर बुद्धिस्टला तर आता त्या डायरेक्शननी पाहिलं तर बुद्धिस्टला आपल्या रिझर्वेशन मिळते. महाराष्ट्रामध्ये 13% आपल्याला रिझर्वेशन मिळतं आहे. अनटचेबल्स जे आधी होते त्यांनी आफ्टर 56 जे कन्व्हर्शन केलं, त्यांना आपण 13% रिझर्वेशनमध्ये आपण शेड्यूल कास्ट म्हणून आपण आज महाराष्ट्रामध्ये त्यांना रिझर्वेशन मिळत आहे. आणि त्याचं स्टेटस आपण पाहिलं तर एक चांगलं एक एज्युकेशनल त्यांचा एक डेव्हलपमेंट झाला आहे, त्यांचा एक आर्थिक डेव्हलपमेंट झालं आहे, सामाजिक डेव्हलपमेंट झालं आहे. आणि रिझर्वेशनमध्ये शेवटी काय आहे, रिझर्वेशनमध्ये शेवटी सोशल चेंज, हा सामाजिक बदल जोपर्यंत होत नाही, सामाजिक बदल झाल्याशिवाय त्या आरक्षणाला काही अर्थ राहत नाही. बुद्धिस्ट लोकांमध्ये सामाजिक बदल झालेला आहे, त्यामुळे निश्चितच रिझर्वेशनचा फायदा या कम्युनिटीला झालेला आहे. आता मुस्लिम किंवा आपण ख्रिश्चनचा एक आपण थोडा इश्यू घेतला तर ही जे 13% शेड्यूल कास्टचं रिझर्वेशन आहे, आणि आपण यांना जर प्रयत्न केला तर ख्रिश्चन आणि मुस्लिम लोकांना रिझर्वेशन देण्याचा शेड्यूल कास्टमध्ये प्रयत्न केला तर निश्चितच आपल्या 13% to 18% आपल्या रिझर्वेशन वाढवावं लागेल. ज्याप्रमाणे EWSचे रिझर्वेशन सेंट्रल गव्हर्नमेंट लागू करते ते सुद्धा घटनेच्या बाह्य आहे असं मला वाटतं. त्याच्यामध्ये जर आपण यांचा विचार केला ख्रिश्चन आणि मुस्लिमचा तर निश्चितपणे आपल्या 13% जास्त 18% आपल्याला रिझर्वेशन वाढवता येईल, त्यांना एनहान्स करता येईल आपल्याला, असं मला याच्यामध्ये एक मांडावंसं वाटते. आणि ते रिझर्वेशन वाढवलं तर निश्चितच या लोकांचा सुद्धा एक फायदा निश्चितच होईल. आता आपण आंध्रा किंवा तिकडे तामिळनाडूचा विचार केला तर आजही एक उदाहरण द्यायचं म्हणजे आजही ख्रिश्चन लोकांचे जे अस्पृश्य ख्रिश्चन कन्व्हर्टेड झाले, अस्पृश्य लोक जे ख्रिश्चन झाले आहेत, कन्व्हर्टेड झाले, त्यांना आजही स्मशानभूमी वेगळी आहे. हे मोठं उदाहरण आज आपल्यासमोर ठेवत आहे डिस्क्रिमिनेशनचं. त्यामुळे निश्चितच या डायरेक्शननी आपल्याला प्रयत्न करावा लागेल. आणि एक देशपांडे सरांनी चांगलं त्यांचे एक रिसर्च सबमिट केला, सर्वांना चांगलं मार्गदर्शन केलं, आणि त्यातून आपल्याला बरंच काही आपल्याला मुद्दे मिळाले आहेत, चांगले एक चळवळीच्या दिशेनं आपल्याला प्रयत्न करता येईल. तर हा मुद्दा माझा एक. आणि दुसरं, हा जो EWSचा मुद्दा सध्या चालत आहे, तर माझं म्हणणं याच्यावर ही राहील की हे जे रिझर्वेशन आहे हे काय गरिबी हटाव नाही आहे. रिझर्वेशन म्हणजे गरिबी हटाव नाही, हे गव्हर्नमेंटने सुद्धा लक्षात ठेवावं, आपण सुद्धा लक्षात ठेवावं आणि त्या दृष्टीने आपल्याला प्रयत्न करणं आवश्यक आहे असं मला वाटते. धन्यवाद. जय भीम.
Thank you, sir. I would request Shri Kishore Khandekar to please felicitate Honorable Sachidananda Darunde. Thank you, sir. We end the session here. Let us move on to the next session. So as we have some speakers online, so we have just reshuffled a few sessions. So we would be moving on to the session 5, that is issues related to EWS reservation. I would request Honorable Sushma Bhad, President Rashtriya OBC Mahila Mahasangha, for chairing the session. And please come up on the stage. So we have with us today Dr. Mohan Gopal, who is former director of NLSUI Bangalore online.
हाँ, मैं ज्वाइन हो गया, मैं ऑनलाइन हूँ, लेकिन आप मुझे हाँ, अब वीडियो और ऑडियो भी आ गया. आप मेरा ऑडियो देख लीजिए, ठीक है कि नहीं?
जी सर, ठीक है. You can start. So please continue. Sir, can you hear me? Sir, can you hear me? No, he can't. Sir, can you hear me? Please start.
Hello, hello, hello.
ज्या व्यक्तीला कॉल केला आहे तो दुसऱ्या कॉलवर व्यस्त आहे. कृपया.
Hello, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Okay. I would like to I'd like to wish everyone a very good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm not able to join you physically. I'm grateful to Dr. Thorat for giving me this opportunity. I will be talking about the reservations under the 103rd Amendment for the economically weaker sections. and I will address three aspects. One is, since the entire conference is on reservations, it is very important that we very briefly put in context the constitutional history and background of reservations, very briefly, as also very relevant to understanding the true nature of the economic weaker section. So the first part, I will briefly touch about what is reservations under the Constitution, why do we have reservations in the Constitution. The second thing I will do is to touch briefly upon the opposition, long-standing opposition to reservations, the anti-reservation movement, and understand its nature. And third, in the background of these two contextual comments, we will address the reservation introduced by the 103rd Amendment. What is it and why should we worry about it? And give you a couple of important reasons that you need to be aware of. So this is what I'm planning to do. And I can't hear anyone speaking this side, but I'm sure someone will call me if there's something going wrong. So let me begin with the context of reservations. What is the origin? We know Article 16(4) of the Constitution says, as you know, which is the first and original mention of the word reservations in the Constitution was in Article 16(4). And Article 16(4), as we know, says, nothing in this article shall prevent the state from making any provision for the reservation of appointments or posts in favor of any backward class of citizens, which in the opinion of the state is not adequately represented in the services under the state. Now, this is not very widely known outside constitutional history circles, that the origin of this Article 16(4) lies in Dr. Ambedkar's first intervention in the first Roundtable Conference in 1930-31. As we all know, he attended the first Roundtable Conference, and there he made an important speech on 19th January 1931, in which he said, and I will just quote from him, a very short, relevant part. Dr. Ambedkar told the first Roundtable Conference, quote, "I have a mandate, and that is, while not opposing responsible government," this is my interruption now, the demand from the Congress was responsible government, namely government responsible to the people. So Dr. Ambedkar says that my mandate is, on behalf of the depressed classes of this country, that while we are not opposed, obviously, to responsible government, my mandate is, and now I'm quoting him, to see that no responsible government is established unless it is at the same time accompanied by a truly representative government. Representative government. So he wanted a government that was both responsible and representative. He said, I'm now continuing to quote him, "I belong to that class which takes its stand on democracy and which seeks to destroy monopoly in every shape and form. Our aim is to realize in practice our ideal of one man, one value in all walks of life, political, economic, and social." Same thing he said in his speech, last speech to the Constituent Assembly in late 1945, November 25, 1945. Now, again, quoting Dr. Ambedkar, "It is because representative government is one means to that end, namely the end of democracy, that the depressed classes attached to it, to representative government, so great a value. And it is because of its value to us that I've urged upon you the necessity of making your declaration subject to the fulfillment of representative government." Now, before he made the speech, Dr. Ambedkar had, as we all know, submitted to the first Roundtable Conference an 8-point memorandum of safeguards, which he said he was doing in order to, and I will just quote just one sentence where he says that, he says, the first thing that was required to be done was to formulate the safeguards deemed necessary by untouchables for their protection against the tyranny and oppression of the Hindus. This I did by submitting a memorandum to the Minorities Committee of the Roundtable Conference. And this memorandum that he submitted to the Roundtable, to the Minorities Committee of the Roundtable Conference, which was chaired by the British Prime Minister, consisted of 9 safeguards, as we all know, and which he also called conditions. Condition number 4 was adequate representation. Condition number 4 was adequate representation in the legislatures, where, as you know, he asserted for the first time in a constitutional forum the constitutional right to elect, for the depressed classes to elect their own men as their representatives. And we know the fate of that is very famous. What is less known is condition number 5, which is called adequate representation in the services. And that is the origin of 16.4. And I'll just read a very short introductory excerpt to the condition 5, which was submitted to the first Roundtable Conference, and it goes as follows. The depressed classes have suffered enormously at the hands of the high caste officers who have monopolized public services by abusing the law or by misusing discretion vested in them in administering it, to the prejudice of the depressed classes and to the advantage of the caste Hindus, without any regard to justice, equity, or good conscience. This mischief can only be avoided by destroying the monopoly of caste Hindus in the public services. Destroying the monopoly of caste Hindus in the public services, and by regulating the recruitment to them to the public services in such a manner, regulating the recruitment to public services in such a manner that all communities, not just depressed classes, all communities, including the depressed, will have an adequate share in them. So adequate share for all communities in public services. That was the demand to as a very concrete measure to realize the objective of representative government, which he described in his 1931 January speech, which I read to you. Then he says here, for this purpose, the depressed classes have to make the following proposals for statutory enactment as part of the constitutional law. 1, there shall be, and this is in the language constitutional, it is in the language of constitutional text. It says 1, there shall be established in India and in each province in India a public service commission to undertake the recruitment and control of public services. 2, then 2 is about independence of the public service commission. I will not read it. It shall be the duty of the public service commission, subject to the tests of efficiency as may be prescribed. A, to recruit services in such a manner as will secure due and adequate representation of all communities. And B, to regulate from time to time priority in employment in accordance with the existing extent of the representation of various communities in any particular service concern. Now, you will notice that this is what became, after going through a very tough and difficult negotiation process, Article 16.4 in the original constitution, which said which was a rare provision, probably unknown in any other constitution in the world, where the fundamental right of unrepresented classes to adequate representation in public services was codified in the Constitution. Now, one very important thing to note here is, in the original formulation of this provision 16.4 on the issue of adequate representation in the services, Dr. Ambedkar wrote his own draft in his own language, not the result of any negotiation or compromise. And in this draft, there is no word backward, there is no word reservation. The words he uses are regulation of recruitment into public services for due and adequate representation of all communities. That regulation of recruitment to public services is what, somewhat mischievously and for a number of other complicated reasons, was called reservation and then denigrated. And the objective was not poverty alleviation, upliftment, it was representation. It was to achieve a representative state, and very beautifully formulated by Dr. Ambedkar, as to ensure the due and adequate representation of all communities in public services. So the first point I want to make is we must understand that what we call reservation is actually the regulation of recruitment into the public services to ensure due and adequate representation of all communities. Why? In order to end the monopoly of public services by high caste officers who because of that monarchy, they abuse the power to benefit themselves and to deny justice, equity, and good conscience to the depressed classes. So it is to end this, what he called in his January 1931 speech, oligarchy, that we have the requirement in the Constitution that we must regulate recruitment to public services to ensure there is no oligarchy. This is not limited by time. It is a permanent safeguard against any oligarchy of any community, so that we have representative government. And whether we are rich or poor, whether you are a community of millionaires or a community of marginalized people, Dr. Ambedkar's principle was everyone must have representation, due and adequate representation, and so that we do not get oppressed by an oligarchy. So this is the first point I want to make of my 3 points, to understand that reservation is not what the dominant classes have consistently made it out to be. How long will reservation continue? How long? 72 years have passed. Generation, second generation, all this is continuing. I'll come back to that. They're attacking it because they're misrepresenting reservation as a means of compensatory discrimination, for historic oppression, or as a tool or instrument for economic development, social development, cultural advancement. None of that. It is purely a democratic tool for ensuring a representative state. This is my first point. A second point I will quickly touch on, leading from this, why this opposition to reservations? We've known that there's been a strong anti-reservation movement, especially post-Mandal. And the question, as I said, is, what is the justification for this? 72 years have passed, blah, 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 blah. But it's very interesting that there is no opposition to the variety of systems of reservation that have arisen after independence. Dr. Ambedkar brought in reservation exclusively as a tool for representation, to achieve a representative state and avoid an oligarchy. He specifically said in discussing 16.4, he wants 50% to be not reserved because we must protect the right to equal opportunity for public employment. This right to equal opportunity for public employment did not come from the high caste, as Dr. Ambedkar called them. It came as a result of the struggle of Dr. Ambedkar and the depressed classes who demanded equality and demanded equal opportunity. So that was precious to them. So he said, look, we want due and adequate representation, but we also want the equal opportunity that we won through our own struggle, the right to equal opportunity for public employment. But therefore, he very, very narrowly restricted reservation, which in itself is a process of regulating recruitment to prevent monopoly and oligopoly, not to create monopoly or oligopoly, to protect equality, not to weaken equality. So whereas this was Dr. Ambedkar's approach, after reservation, by now we have all kinds of, after independence, we have all kinds of reservations, including for sports persons, for children of central government employees in Kendriya Vidyalayas, for unrepresented groups, which are communities which I think are justified, but also includes those who are in the upper caste, such as persons with disability or women. And now we have exclusively for the upper caste, the economically weaker section reservation. Now, this is never attacked by the anti-reservationists as anti-merit. They don't ask how long will this last. No question has been raised about the impact on merit of economically weaker section reservations. No suggestion has been made in Parliament or in the court's proceedings that EWS should be time limited. So they have no problem with reservations, which is not surprising because Chaturvarnya is the ultimate system of reservations. Everything is reserved for somebody and no one can violate the reservation. So reservations come naturally and easily to the cultural DNA of the Savarnas because their whole power rests on reserving resources and opportunities for themselves. So what are they then opposing? So they're not against reservations at all. They love it, they embrace it, and they have no difficulty with it. They only oppose SC, ST, OBC reservations and nothing else. Why is that? And that is because they do not want to change the inequality of power of the communities 3 or 4 communities rule this country. 4 communities rule this country. They are the new caste oligarchy. We don't want their power to be, they don't want their power to be disturbed. They want to maintain that power. They want to prevent other communities which are powerless. There's a huge inequality of power amongst communities in our country. And Dr. Ambedkar's intention was to regulate recruitment into public enterprise, into public services in order to end this oligopoly and to equalize power amongst all communities. So it is to prevent that they have been attacking SC/ST reservations. They don't mind people from OBC, SC/ST communities getting economic reservation, which is for individuals and not for communities. They don't mind them getting women's reservation or sportsmen reservation, but they do not want reservations that will strengthen these communities and equalize power between communities. Dr. Ambedkar had also put into our constitution the provision in the directive principles of state policies that our objective is not only equality amongst individuals, but also between groups. Groups must also be equal, but without having inequality of groups can undermine the equality of individuals and disempower them. So this is very important, essential feature of the constitution, the ideal of group equality. And so the reason that they are attacking us, what their target is really to prevent the empowerment of groups that are within SC/ST, OBC. And that is the reason for their attack. Now, third point leads us to what's wrong with the economically weaker section group. What is wrong with this is that economically weaker section reservation excludes the SC/ST, OBC because it does not want to be an instrument for SC/ST, OBC already have reservations. So why should they get a double reservation? So 2 things to remember on this. One, that to be eligible for sportsperson, women's disability, and these other kinds of reservations is not a disability to get EWS reservations. So you can get a seat even if you don't make it on merit as a sportsperson or as or any of the other categories. And you can also get reservations under EWS. Eligibility for those other kinds of reservations is not a disqualification. But if you are eligible for SC/ST, OBC reservation, you cannot get EWS reservation. So imagine a person who is who is from an SC community. He is not entitled to any reservation except SC reservation. He is excluded from getting EWS reservation. Imagine a person who is from a socially and educationally forward class, who is entitled to, let's say, as an individual, to sportsperson reservation, women's reservation, disabilities reservation, 3 types of reservations. But that person can get also a 4th kind of reservation, which is EWS, and get any one of the, get a job or get a seat in education using any one of these 4 reservations. But if you are a member of the OBC, SC/ST, then you are disqualified. No one has been able to provide a justification for this exclusion. It has nothing to do with duplication of reservation, because as I said, that if that was the case, the constitutional amendment should have said that no one who is entitled or eligible to any kind of reservation should get EWS. That's not what it says. It says you cannot be eligible only to SC/ST, OBC reservation. So it's very clear that the reservation going to SC/ST, OBC communities must be contracted, reserved. They should not get one more opportunity. Now, clearly, no one can get 2 reservations. Like the person from the forward class may be entitled, in my example, to 4 kinds of reservation, but can only actually get only 1 seat or 1 job. So the question is, how many avenues do you have to help you overcome the lack of representation and marginalization to which your community is subject to? And they are trying to close those channels for the SC/ST, OBC reservation. So the first thing to say is that there is no justification for the exclusion. But more importantly, let's look at the inclusion. Why is this, what is the real nature? Is this economic reservation? It's not economic reservation, because if it was economic reservation, it would be available without reference to caste, creed, or any such social factors, social and educational forwardness or backwardness. It would be available to any person who qualifies on the basis of economic criteria, which are multidimensional, below poverty line type of like MDPI, multidimensional poverty index, multiple criteria. So if you're entitled to, if you're eligible and you're below poverty level, you show your BPL card and you get reservations without any inquiry about your social status, your caste, creed, gender, none of that matters, residence, none of that matters. You are BPL, you get reservations. Now, whether that's justified or not, under the theory of Dr. Ambedkar that reservation is a tool of representation, that's a separate issue. But let's argue that those who are BPL do not have adequate representation or voice in our country. They are mostly, as we know from data, SC, ST, OBC. So let them get another shot at having reservations. I don't see any conceptual problem with that because they're also underrepresented and marginalized. But so the idea is that this is not economic reservation because there are two criteria. One is you have to come below a certain very high level, not wealth, but income and land or real estate ownership criteria. That's really a creamy layer cutoff rather than a BPL level. So that's one criterion, which let's say is economic. But there is a second criterion, which is that you should not belong to a socially and educationally backward class, which means you must be a socially and educationally forward class. And in Kerala, for example, in my state, where I'm speaking from, the state has issued a list of eligible communities, and the column is called caste. And it has listed all the most powerful castes in the state as eligible for EWS. So that is not economic criterion. When you say that this is eligible only to the high castes and the powerful, the powerful forward classes. So that is not economic criteria. This is socially and educationally forward class reservation with a creamy layer exclusion, just as backward class reservation is for the socially and educationally backward classes with a creamy layer exclusion. Finally, I think we should also understand the nature of what is an OBC and other backward class. A caste is a class, as the Supreme Court has held in Indira Sawhney and in other cases. But a class is not a caste. So let me explain. Basically, the backward class reservation is meant for groups. The eligibility criteria says any caste or community, any community, which meets over 15 criteria, which are grouped in 4 groups: social, economic, educational, and political representation. So over 15 criteria, secular criteria, in 4 groups. And the essence of those criteria is that these are communities where the men, women, and children have to engage in stigmatized manual labor in order to survive. That is, and they comply with various other indicators, like in the poverty indicators, multidimensional indicators, in order to be, and if they satisfy that, they are treated as a backward class, regardless of the caste or class or religion or background you come from. So I submitted to the Supreme Court that, and I gave them in my written submissions a list of Brahmin communities which are in backward classes right today. We know from the example of our Prime Minister that there are communities which are considered members of the Vaishya classes who are included in backward classes, because those sub-communities of Vaishya classes have been found to be not represented. That was the precise reason why his community apparently was included. So we know that Brahmins, Vaishya, Kshatriya, Shudras are all in backward classes. We know Hindus are, Muslims are. Why the Supreme Court has ordered in a very famous judgment that transgender should be included in the backward classes. Now you call, and they will then be entitled to reservation. Now you call that caste reservation, a reservation which can be given to transgender. The National Commission of Backward Classes once recommended that orphans should be included in the backward classes. So the backward class is a category of marginalization, lack of marginalization and oppression of people who are impoverished and lack representation. And by giving them representation, you're putting power into their hands so that they can tackle the causes that have marginalized them and left them without representation. In fact, similarly with scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, there are criteria which any group that complies with those criteria are eligible to be part of SC/ST. So the only complaint is that groups that are not suffering from any of these disadvantages, they are socially and educationally forward, individuals amongst them must be given reservation. So what this proposition says, to go back to Dr. Ambedkar's framework, is we must now regulate recruitment into public services to provide more representation for the oligarchy, for the high castes who are monopolizing public services, simply because they happen to be individuals. They come from powerful communities, because those communities amongst the high varnas that are not powerful have already been given reservation. If any group has not got reservation, they're still entitled. Even today, they can apply, and if they satisfy the criteria, they can get backward class reservation. So what this EWS has done is, it has created, it has regulated, it has misregulated, if you will, from Dr. Ambedkar's perspective, recruitment into public services to ensure that the same high caste of
There's a link failure from Dr. Mohan Gopal's side. We are trying to reconnect him.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. You can.
Sorry, I'm almost at the end of it. I'm just finishing. I just had one or two very brief points, and then I'll be coming to the end of my 30 minutes. The connection was lost in the middle. So what I was saying is that the EWS is actually preventing representation, blocking representation by those who are unrepresented, and providing representation to members of powerful upper class groups, individually distressed, but powerful upper class groups, so that they can actually uplift their poor, and those groups can get even stronger, So the whole program is to actually retain the strength of the dominant groups, of the oligarchy, and take care of their poor by giving them representation. So this is, whereas those who are unrepresented are being cut off from access to, in the name of economically weaker section. So this is, I call EWS exclusively wholly for Savarna, not economically weaker section. EWS reservation is exclusively and wholly for Savarna reservation, Savarna being a metaphor for the forward classes. So last point I want to make is, let us look also at the impact of this, and I'll conclude with that very briefly. The impact of economically weaker section reservation is that in every classroom of this country, every batch in any educational institution, every office room of this country, every public institution in this country, they have planted a group of 10% of people who have got their seats only by virtue of their being upper caste or forward class. They have a vested interest in maintaining the division between forward and backward class and upper caste and the caste divisions, because it is that has got them the opportunity. They will not allow inside these institutions any questioning of the social system and dismantling of the social schisms that divide the society. So this is an attempt to divide the society at the micro level by putting in a caste apartheid module inside every institution, every public education, public and private space in the country, to ensure that this is not being
recording in progress.
Society. Let me conclude by imagining what this would look like if hypothetically this reservation had been introduced in the United States. We would have had an amendment to the American Constitution that would have said that 10% of all American public employment and 10% of all American education, public and private, shall be reserved only for whites, and only from the poor whites amongst the most powerful white communities, not the poor white communities. Only the poor whites amongst the most powerful white communities will occupy 10% of all public education and private education and public employment in the United States. What would this do to the United States? Will there even now quite right-wing Supreme Court uphold it? What will be the impact of this on merit and quality and competitiveness and knowledge and progress of society, on the development of the country? But this is exactly what has happened here. We've had 10% of all seats in public employment, all seats in private and public education reserved for the poor amongst the most powerful dominant class, oligarchy classes of this country, exclusively for them, so that they will ensure at the micro level that social change never happens in this country. This reservation has been sold in a most duplicitous manner. This description, economically weaker section, is completely false and misleading. It's false advertisement. So we have to reflect on it. We have to understand what it is. It is a great danger to this country. We should ask governments in our states, because the majority judgment of the Supreme Court, while upholding EWS, said in the first paragraph of the first couple of paragraphs of the judgment of one of those judges, that it is not mandatory, it is optional for states to implement. So we should demand that no state should implement this divisive provision of the Constitution, which cuts against the Constitution's commitment. Remember the mandate of Dr. Ambedkar, not only responsible government, but representative government, which cuts against, destroys, blows up the idea of a representative government. It should not be implemented in the states, and we should also all come together and ensure that we vote in such a way that we assemble a 2/3 majority in Parliament that will, on the very first day, remove this cancer which has been put inside the Constitution, an oligarchic provision, an anti-representative provision, an anti-democratic provision, put into the heart and soul of the Constitution, which is Part 3, fundamental rights of the Constitution. So let us come together to protect democracy, protect development, protect a better future of our country by pursuing Dr. Ambedkar's call 91 years ago, that we must have not only a responsible government, but a representative government. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Now I would request Honorable Sushma Bhad to please present a bouquet and memento to Dr. Mohan Gopal online. Sir, please accept the memento and the bouquet as well online. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. There are no questions as such, so you can leave. Yes, sir.
Recording in progress.
Ma'am, I would request you to please be seated for the next session, as one of the speaker for this session is yet to join. So we'll continue with the next session, which is on issues. The session is on issues related to women. To chair this session, I would request Honorable Kalpana Meshram, President of Sakhi Mahila Manch, to please come on the stage. As well as I would like to call upon the second speaker for the session, Dr. Vimal Thorat, National Convener, National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, Delhi. Please come on the dais. And I would now request the first speaker of the session, Honorable Subhasini Ali. She is the ex-member of Parliament as well as Vice President of AIDWA, and she's online with us. I would request ma'am to please deliver your speech. Ma'am, if you can hear me, please unmute yourself.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Please begin.
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to be invited to this occasion. And in spite of all the problems with going digital, anyway, at least we're able to have this program. So now when we talk about reservations in the context of women, there are two very different kinds of reservation that I would just like to draw everybody's attention to. Number one, I feel that the government that we have today in India is a government that has never accepted the constitution, which was largely due to the hard work of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, and the Sangh Parivar, to which this government belongs, had said in 1950 itself that they do not accept this constitution and that they are committed to Manusmriti. Now, if they are committed to Manusmriti, which they have themselves admitted that they are, then obviously they are completely adverse. Can I be heard? I can hear people talking. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you. Please continue.
Can you hear me? Huh?
We can hear you, ma'am. Please continue.
I can't hear what you're saying. What did you say? So should I just continue and just keep speaking? Okay, so since this government is one that has committed to replacing the constitution of constitutional provisions with Manuvadi provisions, it is not surprising that they are attacking reservation, the very concept of reservation, from all sides. And I would like to say that very often the way it is impacting on Dalit women and Dalit girls, or even OBC and ST women and girls, is left out in the debate. But actually, the complete constriction of reservations, the limiting of reservations, is actually impacting in the worst possible way on young Dalit girls, Dalit women, ST and OBC women and girls. Now, why do I say this? If we look at the job sector, obviously when privatization is being encouraged, the public sector is shrinking, the government jobs are not being increased. In fact, the government vacant posts are not being filled either by the central government or by the state government. And only contractual work or outsourcing is being resorted to by the governments. Then in such a situation, women and girls will get no jobs at all. They will be left out of the job market completely. And that is what we are seeing, that after the COVID pandemic, actually more women have lost jobs than men. Now, this is a very serious situation because even earlier, women were not getting anywhere near what was their due as far as reserved were concerned. And as we know, it is sanitation workers in that category that mostly Dalits have been getting jobs. And now 80% of sanitation workers in our country are Dalit women. So where are the decent jobs? Where are the benefits of reservation in jobs for Dalit women and Dalit girls? They are suffering even more than Dalit men and Dalit boys. And of course, ST women and girls, OBC women and girls are facing exactly the same levels of deprivation. So I think that instead of paying only lip service to the concept or to the demand for reservation in the private sector, this should be taken up very seriously. I would request all the people who are organizing this program to call a conference of political parties, of social organizations, of Dalit organizations, of organizations fighting for Dalit rights to come and take a stand on the question of reservations in the private sector. Simply saying, yes, this should happen is not going to make it happen. Under neoliberalism, it has become even more difficult than before, but it has also become more essential than before. And so I would request Dr. Thorat and others to take this up in a very serious way by making everybody come, make them make their views public, and then make them take a stand and prove that they are really serious about this demand. Now, similarly, if we go into education, the new education policy doesn't talk about public education at all. And more than 20,000 government schools have actually been closed or merged with other schools, which means that the space for reservation in education from the primary level right to the highest level of education is shrinking. In places like Madhya Pradesh and Haryana, there's a strange situation where children who are being admitted into government schools have to pay fees of 500 rupees, and children being admitted into private schools, the government is paying 1,500 rupees a month to the private school. Now, what does this mean? This means that very soon, the government schools will be completely finished, state by state, especially in states ruled by the BJP. And this subsidy that is being paid to the private schools will certainly not help Dalit children, OBC children, and scheduled tribe children to access education. And it will be, of course, the girls who will suffer the most. So I think that this gender aspect of the squeezing of reservations in jobs and in education must be given special attention, because already we are seeing that dropout rates among Dalits, which have been high, are increasing, especially as far as girls are concerned. And of course, this applies to other reserved categories also. Now, the central government has stopped the scholarships. Up to the matriculate level, they are not going to pay any scholarships, either to SC, ST, or OBC children or to Muslim children. That means that the most deprived of education, those who are getting some benefits from reservation, are now going to be deprived completely of these benefits. These are very serious questions, and I think that the gender aspect and all other aspects are really not being taken as seriously as they should be. Now, because of course I have very limited time, I would like to come to the other reservation that women have been demanding, and that is reservation in the Lok Sabha and the Vidhan Sabha. Now, I know there's a lot of controversy about a reservation on the basis of caste, and I want to say very clearly that we who have been demanding 33% reservation in assemblies and Lok Sabha, we are really not concerned about the caste of the people who are going to get the benefit of this reservation. Already, SC and STs have got a reservation which is legal, it cannot be tampered with, and once 1/3 of that is given to women, then Dalit women and ST women, of course, will be 1/3 of the total number elected. There's a question of OBC women. Now, if we see the numbers of OBC men who are elected, I don't really think that OBC women, once 1/3 education comes, will be deprived. But if any changes people want to make, we have no problem. But of course, everybody on this distinguished panel understands you cannot have a reservation for OBC women and not for OBC men. So if there is going to be a quota within a quota, it has to be for men and women. Actually, the problem is that all these red herrings are brought up simply to deprive women of the right to be elected. They can be voters, but they cannot be elected. We should understand what the real problem is. It is a problem of patriarchy combined with all the other problems that women face in getting elected, the problem of money, the problem of power, the problem of criminalization. Along with that, patriarchy is a very, very big hurdle in the way of women accessing representation. So as far as quota within quota is concerned, it will have to be for men and women. But let us have a discussion. What is the reality? The Women's Reservation Bill has never been discussed in Parliament. Before the discussion starts, there is a ruckus. People start tearing up the bill, and it is postponed for another few years. Now it is nearly 20 years, and there has not yet been a discussion. Why are the people who are members afraid of a discussion? Let it be discussed. Come up with your suggestions. Increase whatever kind of reservation within reservation you want. It doesn't make any difference. We are only interested in seeing that 33% of MLAs and MPs should be women. That should be guaranteed. And that is what we are all fighting for. And I think that those who are fighting for social justice must lend their voices to this struggle. And finally, I would say, please also look at what is happening at reservation for women in the local bodies. First of all, Dalit women who are elected at that level of panchayats and so on, what is the humiliation to which they're being subjected? They're not allowed to hoist the flag. They're not allowed to sit on a chair. They're not allowed to attend meetings. This is apart from the general problem of women being proxies for their husbands or their fathers-in-law or the male members of their family who want to wield that power. So why is this problem not being addressed? I would like to tell you that the government, state governments of Haryana and Rajasthan brought in laws which said that in homes in which there was no toilet, the family member could not stand for election, or where the contestant had not studied up to the 10th standard, he or she would be ineligible. Who was this hurting? This was hurting Dalit women, the poorest of the poor, who lack access to education, who lack access to minimum amenities. We fought the case right up to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the courts didn't listen to us. They live in some other kind of Alice in Wonderland land. But it's a good thing that the Rajasthan government did away with that law. But these are the kind of laws that BJP governments want to bring in. Please be very, very vigilant about this, because such laws, while seemingly affecting all candidates, are actually going to affect the poorest, the least educated, and the having least access to amenities, which are Dalits and especially Dalit women. So these are all ways in which Dalit women are being deprived of their rights, either after they win elections or to win elections at all at the local bodies level. And I'm sorry to say that when these battles were being fought, when this opposition was being voiced, unfortunately, those who are in the forefront of the struggles for social justice did not join these battles, did not lend their voices. So on this panel, I would just like to request everyone that please look at the gender aspect of reservation and the way in which loss of reservation, circumscribing of reservation, tightening and squeezing of reservation is squeezing out Dalit girls and Dalit women from jobs and from education, how the reservation which exists for local bodies for women is being used, manipulated to thwart the entry of poor women and Dalit women and tribal women into panchayats, into local bodies, and also humiliating them. These are very big issues also. And 33% reservation for women. Please, everybody make it everybody's battle. Make it a battle for social justice. It doesn't matter if there's reservation within reservation, let there be a discussion. Let there be some concrete proposals, but let us at least see that 33% women form the members of the Lok Sabha and the members of the assemblies. That is all I have to say on this subject. Thank you all very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would request Honorable Kalpana Meshram to please present a memento and bouquet online to ma'am. Ma'am, please accept this online felicitation. Thank you. This is the memento. Thank you, ma'am. Let's move on to the next speech. I would invite Dr. Vimal Thorat, National Convener, National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights, Delhi, to please deliver her speech. Ma'am, time allotted to you is 10 minutes.
सभागार में उपस्थित सभी भाई और बहनों को जय भीम, जय सावित्री, जोहार। अभी हमने सुभाषिनी जी अली को सुना है और सुभाषिनी जी संसद में राज्यसभा की मेंबर रह चुकी हैं, तो उनके पास बहुत ज़्यादा जानकारी भी है इस समय और वो इस पर बहुत ही ज़्यादा अच्छी तरह से बात कर पाई है। मुझे लगता है महिला आरक्षण बिल के ऊपर उन्होंने बहुत ज़्यादा फोकस नहीं डाला है और जो कि एक बहुत लंबे समय से राज्यसभा लोकसभा में बहुत लंबित एक बिल है जो कि अभी तक पास हो जाना चाहिए। लगभग 22 साल हो गए हैं, क्योंकि जब पहली बार 1996 में ये बिल देवेगौड़ा के संसद में रखा गया था, तो उस समय कुछ सांसद, कुछ समाजवादी पार्टी के राजद और मुलायम सिंह यादव और शरद यादव, लालू यादव, इन लोगों ने, इन तीन पार्टीज़ के लोगों ने, रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स ने इसका विरोध किया था कि ये कहकर विरोध किया था कि इसमें ओबीसी महिलाओं का रिप्रेजेंटेशन निश्चित होना चाहिए। और एक मायने में बिल्कुल सही था, उनका विरोध बिल्कुल सही था, लेकिन उस विरोध को बहुत ही अलग ढंग से लिया गया कि ये इनका जो विरोध है ये केवल जो उन्होंने कुछ शब्द भी इस्तेमाल किए थे जो कि बहुत ही डेरोगेटरी थे, जो कि नहीं किए जाने चाहिए थे किसी भी महिला के लिए। तो उसका असर ये हुआ कि वो बिल उस समय पारित नहीं हुआ। फिर दोबारा ये रखा गया देवेगौड़ा के बाद 1998 में ये दोबारा कानून मंत्री थम्बी दुरई के समय में रखा गया। उस समय इस पर इतना हंगामा हुआ कि विधेयक की जो कॉपी है, विधेयक का जो डॉक्यूमेंट है, उसे ही फाड़ दिया गया और हाथापाई तक की नौबत आई और ये बिल फिर पास नहीं हुआ। जबकि संविधान के संशोधन में 108वां जो विधेयक है, जिससे ये निश्चित हो चुका है कि 33% रिजर्वेशन, जो कि अभी पंचायत में जिस तरह का रिजर्वेशन है और जिस तरह से पंचायत में महिलाएं बहुत ही अच्छा अपने कार्य से बहुत ही अच्छा उसका असर दिखाई दे रहा है गांव के विकास पर। गांव में जितनी भी पंचायत राज के जितने भी काम हैं, कुछ राज्यों में 36 काम हैं, 36 कार्य है, अगर वो उसको लागू करती है, लागू करने के लिए जो परिस्थितियां हैं उसके साथ में अगर होती है, खास करके पुरुष सत्ता, क्योंकि जहाँ पर हमने देखा है कि यहाँ सिर्फ प्रॉक्सी ही सरपंच की चल रही है, या तो पति चला रहे हैं, सरपंच महिला है जिसको कि चुना गया है और ये लीगल और वैधानिक उनकी जो पद है, इस पद का इतना दुरुपयोग किया जा रहा है और वो भी उनके ही समाज के, हमारे ही समाज के पुरुषों के द्वारा, उनके अपने गांव के लोगों के द्वारा, गांव के पुरुषों के द्वारा या उनके परिवार के पुरुषों के द्वारा। तो हमने जहाँ पर भी महिलाओं की पंचायत में जो दलित महिलाएं काम कर रही हैं, पंचायत सरपंच है, उनकी जितनी भी मीटिंग्स हमने कॉल की है पूरे भारत में, लगभग 8 से 10 राज्यों में, तो उनके साथ उनके पति या भाई या बेटा या काका या मामा ज़रूर चला आएगा। ये जो उसकी जो आज़ादी है, उसे जो मिला हुआ एक जो अवसर है कि अपने बलबूते पर अपने एक अधिकार का जो एक पंचायत राज ने उसे जो अधिकार दिया है, उसका इस्तेमाल करके वो अपने गांव की सेवा करे या विकास में पूरी भागीदारी निभाए, वो भी उससे नहीं, ये भी उसे बर्दाश्त नहीं है। तो पुरुष सत्ता पर ये सवाल आता है, बार बार आता है कि महिला अकेली जो सरपंच महिला है वो अमरावती से नागपुर या नागपुर से अमरावती तक अकेली नहीं जा सकती, या मीटिंग अटेंड करने के लिए अकेले नहीं जा सकती है, जहाँ पर उसको ट्रेनिंग दिया जा रहा है। ये मैं अपनी बात कह रही हूँ ऑल इंडिया दलित महिला अधिकार मंच से। अभी नवंबर में एक ट्रेनिंग प्रोग्राम ऑर्गेनाइज किया था जिसमें 35 सरपंच, दलित आदिवासी सरपंच महिलाएं आई थी, लेकिन बहुत ज़्यादातर महिलाओं के साथ उनका वही जो मैंने पहले बताया, एक पुरुष व्यक्ति उसमें ज़रूर उनके साथ था। तो ये जो एक पुरुष सत्ता का जो एक प्रभाव है और जो कि पूरा कंट्रोल अपने हाथ में रखना चाहता है, चाहे वो विधानसभा है, चाहे वो सांसद है। संसद में ये जो बिल पास नहीं हो रहा है कि ये केवल लालू यादव या मुलायम यादव जी को, जो अब नहीं है, वो हमारे बीच में नहीं है तो उनका नाम हम नहीं लेंगे, लेकिन शरद यादव जी और लालू यादव जी का नाम की वजह से नहीं है। इसमें पूरी संसद में बैठे हुए वो सारे नुमाइंदे जो सांसद है, पुरुष सांसद है, उनका भी बहुत बड़ा हाथ है। ये नहीं कि केवल 2 पुरुषों को अलग कर दिया और उस पार्टी को अपने बदनाम कर दिया और ताउम्र उनको बदनामी का उनके सिर पर बदनामी मढ़ती है। ये ज़रूरी है कि जब अब आप देखेंगे कि कांग्रेस के यूपीए के सेकंड यूपीए के समय जब ये बिल राज्यसभा में पास होता है 2010 में, तो राज्यसभा में जाकर राज्यसभा में पास होता है और लोकसभा तक जाते जाते ये फिर रुक जाता है। हमने यूं ही मजाकिया तौर पर दिल्ली में राज्यसभा और लोकसभा के क्योंकि गुस्सा बहुत था महिलाओं में, जो भी बहुत समय से इस पर काम कर रही है और लगातार इस बिल को पास करने में अपनी पूरी ऊर्जा और शक्ति लगा रही है, और पूरे तर्क के साथ और अपने अधिकार को लेने के लिए, जो संविधान ने दिए गए प्रदत्त अधिकार जो है उसे लेने के लिए, तो हमने राज्यसभा और लोकसभा के भीतर जाने का कितने पद, मतलब हम कितनी वहाँ पर जाने का कितना समय लगता है, या हमने गिने थे कि कितने पैर वहाँ तक पहुँच सकते हैं, कितने पैर आप डालेंगे। तो ये एक मजाक था, लेकिन वो मजाक नहीं था, उस तरह से वो मजाक नहीं है कि राज्यसभा में पास होने के बाद ये बिल लोकसभा में फिर रुक गया, और वहाँ फिर वही हंगामा और वही शोर शराबा। और क्योंकि महिला सांसदों की संख्या भी बहुत कम थी, चाहे पक्ष की हो अपक्ष की है, दोनों ने बहुत कोशिश की, सभी के साथ बातचीत हुई थी, और उस समय एक माहौल बना था, लेकिन नहीं हो पाया। तो इसमें जो बात सुभाषिनी जी ने जो बार बार कही है कि SC/ST महिलाओं का, अनुसूचित जनजाति और अनुसूचित जनजाति महिलाओं का ऑलरेडी इन्हें 33% में उनका शेयर है, जो भी शेयर है। लेकिन आज़ादी के इतने साल हो गए हैं, और ये जो राजनीतिक जो आरक्षण मिला हुआ है, आप और हम देख रहे हैं कि कितनी जो पार्टियां हैं, जो खास करके दलित पार्टियां जिन्हें कहा जाएगा, राजनीतिक पार्टियां, उन्होंने कितनी महिलाओं को सीटें दी है और अपने से दी है, जिससे कि ये दावा करना कि 33% आरक्षण आते ही इनका अलग से इनको कोटा मिल जाएगा, इसकी क्या गारंटी है? हमें गारंटी चाहिए। और इसीलिए दलित महिला आंदोलन की जितनी भी नेत्रियां हैं, उन्होंने ये बात हर जगह पर रखी, और पूरे जोश में रखी, और पूरे ज़ोरदार तरीके से रखी कि 33% रिजर्वेशन के भीतर भी हमें रिजर्वेशन चाहिए, क्योंकि कोटा विद इन द कोटा जब तक ये तय नहीं होगा, जैसे कि OBC महिलाओं के लिए मांगा गया है, अगर ये पूरा जब तक नहीं तय होता है, तब तक ये बिल पास होने में जो अड़चनें आ रही हैं, या जो पूरी उसे रोकने की कोशिश की जा रही है, वो होती रहेगी। और हो सकता है कि हमारे चले जाने के बाद जो दूसरी पीढ़ी आएगी, जो लता और इनकी पीढ़ी आएगी, शायद उनको ये मौका मिले। क्योंकि मैं खुद ही इस आंदोलन से पिछले 22 साल से जुड़ी हुई हूँ। हर वर्ष जब भी विंटर सेशन आता है या मानसून सेशन आता है, उससे पहले एक रिलीजियस वे में, जिसे हमें रिलीजियस मतलब उस रिलीजन की बात नहीं कर रही हूँ कि कोई किसी धर्म के साथ इसे जोड़ा जाए, हम बहुत ही सारी जितनी भी नेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस है, पूरे भारत में जितनी भी नेशनल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस है, वो सब दिल्ली में इकट्ठा होकर अपने पैसे खर्च करके सब अपने तहत आते हैं, और ये एक मेमोरेंडम लेकर हम प्राइम मिनिस्टर, अपक्ष पक्ष के जो भी नेता हो गए, उनसे लोकसभा मेंबर और तमाम जो ज़रूरी जिनसे मिलना होता है, और प्राइम मिनिस्टर और प्रेसिडेंट, इनको लगातार इस तरह से एक के बाद मिलकर उनसे ये हम रिक्वेस्ट करते रहे हैं, मेमोरेंडम प्रस्तुत करते रहे हैं। केवल 2 साल नहीं किया गया जब कोविड था। तो 20 साल से तो मैं ही इस पर आमादा हूँ कि ये बिल मेरे रहते हुए पास हो जाए, लेकिन मुझे लगता है कि ये बिल पास होने में अभी भी पुरुष सत्ता, जो संसद में बैठे हुए जो पुरुष वर्ग है, जो नहीं चाहते हैं कि उनकी सीट छीन जाए। छीनने का कोई सवाल नहीं है, ये रिप्रेजेंटेशन का सवाल है। जो बाबा साहब ने कहा है कि अगर जब तक ये एक टूल है, जो अभी मोहन जी ने भी यही बात कही, एक टूल है कि आपके रिप्रेजेंटेशन को, रिजर्वेशन इज़ अ टूल फॉर रिप्रेजेंटेशन। तो अगर रिप्रेजेंटेशन नहीं होगा, जो कि आधी दुनिया है, महिलाएं इस देश की आधी दुनिया मानी जाती है, आधी आबादी है, उस आधी आबादी का आज जो रिप्रेजेंटेशन संसद में है वो केवल 12% है। हमें शर्म आनी चाहिए, हमारे देशवासियों को शर्म आनी चाहिए, हमारे सांसदों को शर्म आनी चाहिए, हमारे जो नुमाइंदे बैठे हुए हैं संसद में उन्हें शर्म आनी चाहिए कि जहाँ छोटे छोटे राज्यों में या एक नॉर्वे और स्वीडन जैसे राज्यों में जहाँ सांसद महिलाओं की संख्या 22-26% तक है। पाकिस्तान की महिला संसद महिलाएं ज़्यादा है, उनकी संख्या भारत की संख्या से ज़्यादा है। तो हमें शर्म आनी चाहिए, और मुझे लगता है कि ये इसी तरह से अगर ये पास नहीं हुआ तो ये एक गले में अटका हुआ फांस रहेगा। और इसके लिए महिलाओं को ही नहीं केवल अपनी बात कहनी चाहिए कि ये महिलाओं का आरक्षण है, सभी पुरुषों से जो भी इस लोकतंत्र में विश्वास रखते हैं, जो संविधान में विश्वास रखते हैं, जो बाबा साहब के इस कथन पर विश्वास रखते हैं कि रिजर्वेशन इज़ अ टूल ऑफ रिप्रेजेंटेशन, तो रिप्रेजेंटेशन सबको चाहिए। और रिप्रेजेंटेशन जब तक नहीं होगा, वो समस्याएं जो हम जानते हैं, जो महिलाओं की समस्याएं जो हम जानते हैं, जो दलित महिला की या आदिवासी महिला की या घुमंतु महिला की या ओबीसी महिला की जो समस्याएं हैं, वो जो निजी समस्याएं हैं, उसकी जो पानी का सवाल है, उसके घर में बिजली नहीं है, उसके घर में आज गैस लेने की उसकी क्षमता नहीं है, उसकी बेरोज़गारी दिनों दिन बढ़ती जा रही है, उसे न्यूनतम मजदूरी नहीं मिलती है, उसके ऊपर होने वाला उत्पीड़न अभी भी ख़त्म नहीं हुआ है। और आए दिन जो आंकड़े हमारे सामने आते हैं वो चौंकाने वाले हैं, हमें शर्मिंदा करने वाले आंकड़े हैं कि इस लोकतंत्र में, इस समाजवादी लोकतंत्र में, जिसका सपना हमारे बड़े बड़े नेताओं ने, बाबा साहेब अम्बेडकर ने देखा था, सरदार वल्लभ भाई पटेल ने देखा था, और तब तमाम जो उस समय के जो आज़ादी में जो शामिल थे उन्होंने देखा था, वो सपना सब पूरा नहीं हुआ है। और वो सपना तभी पूरा होगा जबकि इस बिल के साथ या महिलाओं के आरक्षण के साथ केवल संसद और असेंबली में जो रिजर्वेशन है उसी की बात नहीं हो रही है, हर जगह पर उन्हें रिजर्वेशन की ज़रूरत है। नौकरियों में उनकी संख्या दिन ब दिन कम होती जा रही है। सुभाषिनी जी ने अभी ये बात कही है, और ये हम सब जानते हैं कि जब से निजीकरण हुआ है, प्राइवेटाइजेशन हुआ है, सबसे ज़्यादा छटनी जो होती है वो महिलाओं की होती है। आप अगर देखेंगे कि जो भी छोटे छोटे गृहोद्योग है या छोटे कारखाने हैं, वहाँ पर जैसे ही यंत्र आते हैं, यंत्र से जब भी काम होना शुरू होता है तो सबसे ज़्यादा छटनी महिलाओं की होती है। उन्हें कौशलहीन मजदूर माना जाता है। केवल ये क्षेत्र बचा है जहाँ पर उनकी छटनी कम होती है, वो है किसानी। खेती में जो किसानी करती है महिलाएं या जो मजदूर महिलाएं हैं खेतों में काम करने वाली, वहाँ पर भी जाति के आधार पर छटनी होती है या उन्हें काम दिया जाता है। ये भी हमारे सामने इसके आंकड़े हैं, और इसके ऊपर बहुत सारी रिसर्च हो चुके हैं। IIDS का एक रिसर्च हमारे सामने है, इंडियन इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ दलित स्टडीज़ का एक रिपोर्ट है, जिसमें ये बात सामने आई है कि जब भी जो भी मालिक है, ज़मीन का मालिक है, वो अपनी कास्ट की जो महिलाएं हैं उनको पहले काम देते हैं, और अगर बचा है कुछ तो फिर दलित महिलाओं की तरफ आते। तो वहाँ पर भी ये दुराभाव है, वहाँ पर भी भेदभाव किया जाता है। ऐसे समय में अगर हम सिर्फ 33% आरक्षण की बात करें और सिर्फ कुछ महिलाएं वहाँ पहुँच जाएगी, लेकिन वो अपनी एक वजूद के साथ, एक स्वाभिमान के साथ और एक लक्ष्य के साथ वहाँ पहुँचेगी। क्योंकि महिलाएं क्रिमिनलाइजेशन में उनका बहुत ज़्यादा विश्वास नहीं होता है, या जो भ्रष्टाचार का जो मामला है, भ्रष्टाचार में उनका बहुत ज़्यादा इंटरेस्ट नहीं होता है, मतलब मैं ऐसा समझती हूँ। हो सकता है आप लोगों के पास और बात आपको मालूम होगी, लेकिन ये एक 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 महिला के जो एक व्यक्तित्व है, उसमें उसके साथ ये दो चीज़ें कभी भी नहीं जुड़ सकती। एक क्रिमिनलाइजेशन, मतलब जो अपने पद पर रहते हुए किसी और को हटाने का या उसे क्रिमिनल के द्वारा उसको नष्ट करने का, ये मुझे लगता है ये साहस वो नहीं कर सकती। और भ्रष्टाचार में बहुत कम महिलाओं को अभी तक हमने डूबते हुए देखा है। तो ये दो चीज़ें अगर ख़त्म कर दे तो शायद इस देश का भविष्य और अधिक उज्जवल हो सकता है। लेकिन बात वही है, वहीं पर आकर रुकती है कि अगर संसद में बैठे हुए जो नुमाइंदे हैं, और इस समय की जो मौजूदा सरकार की जो संसद है, उसमें सबसे ज़्यादा उनका बहुमत है। उन्हें तो ये बिल पास करने में दो तिहाई मतदान उनके फेवर में हो सकता है, केवल उनको बात ही कहनी है। क्योंकि वैसे तो सभी भक्त बने हुए हैं, अगर भक्तगणों को अगर एक इशारा भी देते हैं उनके जो भगवान हैं, तो शायद हो सकता है कि ये मौका आ सकता है। लेकिन ये इच्छा शक्ति और महिलाओं के प्रति एक इस देश का जो दायित्व है, या इस देश की महिलाओं को एक प्रतिनिधित्व देने की जो बात है, मुझे लगता है ये अगर हो जाए तो आने वाले कुछ समय में ये बात हो सकती है। 2024 में ये लोकसभा भी विसर्जित हो जाएगी। तो अभी 2 साल इनके साथ सामने है और ये एक उनको चुनौती है। हम इस मंच से और आज के इस कार्यक्रम के द्वारा हम, थैंक यू, मेरा सिर्फ 1 मिनट बाकी है, तो हम एक चुनौती देते हैं कि अभी तक तो आप बहुत चिल्लाते रहे हैं जब कांग्रेस सरकार, यूपीए सरकार 1 और 2 के समय, कि आपने अपने जो उनके साथ जितने भी यूपीए के साथ जितने शामिल थे उनके गठबंधन में, उनको आप उनकी राय नहीं ले पाए या उनको राज़ी नहीं कर पाए। लेकिन अब तो आपके पास पूरी की पूरी संसद में आपका बहुमत है, तो अब आप कहाँ, आपके क्या हाथ बंधे हुए हैं? तो बंधे हुए नहीं हैं तो ले आए, और महिलाओं को एक मौका मिलेगा और संसद में बैठने का और निर्णय लेने का। और 33% महिलाएं अगर आती है और कुछ बहुत अच्छे निर्णय लेती है, तो वो देश के विकास के संबंध में ही होंगे, विकास के भलाई के लिए ही होंगे या बेहतरी के लिए ही होंगे। तो मुझे लगता है कि मेरा 1 मिनट भी ख़त्म हो रहा है, मैं अपनी बात यहीं ख़त्म करती हूँ। जय भीम, जय जोहार।
Thank you, ma'am. I would request Honorable Kalpana Mishram, chairperson for the session, to please felicitate ma'am. So we have with us our next speaker from the session 5, that is issues related to EWS reservation, Dr. Disha Wadekar. She is advocate for Supreme Court, Delhi. She is present online. I'll request ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, now you are audible. Please begin.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I've been given the topic issues related to EWS reservation, and I'll be speaking about it. Mohan Gopal sir has already addressed the topic. I think I will not get into the many nitty-gritties of what EWS reservations is and how this provision came and what are the details of the provision. I think I will be mostly addressing the larger topic of how the EWS reservations, EWS quota that came by the 103rd Amendment is in itself a constitutionally backward-looking provision, in a sense that I would argue that it is a provision that ushers in a pre-constitutional era. And I am not going to get into the minute details of whether 8 lakh, the criteria of 8 lakh limit, or the 50% criteria and the other nitty-gritties about EWS reservation, because it is not a technical issue. It is the EWS quota in itself, which came by a constitutional amendment. So it is not a benign executive order or a statutory provision, but it is a constitutional provision which came by an extraordinary provision in the Constitution through Article 368, which grants an amending power to the Parliament to amend the Constitution, to make changes in the Constitution. Article 368 allows the Parliament to make changes, to make amendments in the Constitution, but there are some limitations to that provision, and the limitations have been in some manner provided in Article 368 itself. There were questions raised as to the amending power of the Constitution in this very famous case called the Keswan and the Bharati case, where it was argued whether this Constitution amendment power, which lies with the Parliament, whether that could go to the extent of repealing the Constitution itself, repealing the very spirit, the very intent of the Constitution. And that is where the judges actually came out with a concept called as the basic structure concept, or the basic structure doctrine, which basically is borrowed from implied limitations concept, which means that there are certain limitations within the document, within the Constitution itself. And it cannot be amended to the extent that you do away with the very spirit, the very nature of the Constitution. So the extent of amending the Constitution is what was discussed when the EWS hearings, as you all know, happened in the Supreme Court recently. And the court was only on the issue of first principles, whether this amendment, this 103rd Amendment, which came with a resounding majority. Article 368 requires that 2/3 of there is a majority of 2/3, at least a 2/3 majority, if you have to amend the Constitution with a ratification of half the states. So it's an extraordinary provision of amending the Constitution. And the only issue before the court was whether this amendment, the EWS amendment, was actually violating what is understood as the basic structure or the basic foundation of the Constitution. And because the basic structure doctrine immediately comes in when you talk about Article 368, amending power of the Constitution, it is very important, even at the time of arguments before the Supreme Court, to see what are these provisions or what are these principles, these first principles that are so inherent to the Constitution that would be violated by this 103rd Amendment. And immediately 3 things came up, 3 principles came up. One was the principle of social justice. As you all know, if we read the preamble, one of the first principles that strikes is the principle of social justice, which is so important to the nature, the inherent nature of the Indian Constitution. The second principle was that of equality. And like we know, in this soil of India, like Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had argued in the Constituent Assembly, he said that this is an undemocratic soil, where in the social and socio-economic realm, we are not equal, but constitutionally we have given powers politically we have given powers where we are imagining a nation which is embedded in the idea of equality. So social justice, equality, and the third very important principle, and that is the principle that I'd like to discuss today, is the principle of democracy. And it is my argument and it is my assertion that the EWS reservation and the EWS quota is actually inherently undemocratic. Rather, it is anti-democratic. As Dr. Mohan Gopal has very eloquently argued, and it has also been reiterated by Dr. Vimal Thorat ma'am, that reservation as a policy, reservation as a tool of the Constitution came into being through a very specific objective of representation. And it is very important for us to understand the idea of representation as something so essential and inherent to the idea of democracy. To understand this context, I think it's important to see under what circumstances did the Indian Constitution come into being. As Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar had argued that in the Constituent Assembly, and this is one of the speeches that is often quoted and everyone knows about it, but let me just go back to the speech where he says that we are entering into this realm where essentially in the socio-economic realm, we are undemocratic, where people from marginalized sections, from historically marginalized groups, have never had a look into the democracy, have never had a look into the state power. They've not been able to share the state power, and they have been systematically excluded through various systems of caste, patriarchy, so on and so forth. And this systematic exclusion of certain communities in the pre-constitutional era is really important for us to understand, because it is in this context that Constitution came into being. And therefore, it was a radical document of change, because it was ushering in a new era, where it gave the promise of equal participation, of sharing of state power, right? And therefore, this is where the concept of representation comes in. This is where the idea behind Article 16.4, which is the original provision of reservations. Article 16.4 gave reservations to backward classes. And there was enough discussion in the Constituent Assembly around Article 16.4 as to why this provision is necessary. And if you look into, if you dive deep into the Constituent Assembly debates, you will understand that, as Dr. Mohan Gopal has spoken about, that this provision came into being as a provision for representation of the historically excluded communities. In one instance, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, he's been asked in the Constituent Assembly debates as to why this Article 16.4 is necessary. And I think that is literally the crux of what reservations, or this tool of reservations, means for the Constitution, because he says that these are the communities, and there are certain communities and historically marginalized communities that have not had a proper look into the administration, a proper look into the mainstream administration of this country. And he talks about the necessity of this proper look into the administration, because this is a provision concerning reservation in public employment and therefore public administration, right? So he spoke about how it was necessary for any idea or concept of democracy or any imagination of democracy to have an equal participation from the historically marginalized groups, from amongst the historically marginalized groups, right? So essentially this provision came into this when this Article 16.4 provision of reservations came into being. It signified and it embodied not just a provision for the upliftment of the historically marginalized. As you will all know, that reservations is hardly an upliftment provision. It's not a welfareist provision. It is a provision that came for the very object of democracy, for the very object to overturn the pre-constitutional era, or what we understood as this undemocratic soil that we had, which was entrenched in caste and patriarchy and Brahmanism, which never gave the marginalized communities a chance to participate, equally participate in democracy, right? And as such, this provision is not just an, a provision of upliftment of the marginalized groups, but it was in essence a provision that embodied the very idea of democracy. Now, when I say that the EWS quota or the EWS reservations is anti-democratic, I am essentially saying that in a way, when Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar also talked about Article 16.4 in the Constituent Assembly debate, or there was K.M. Munshi who also added to the discussion on Article 16.4, or K.T. Shah who added to the discussion on 16.4. When they spoke of the provision of reservations, they were not caste blind. So when they spoke about the representation of marginalized groups, they were also reiterating that there are certain communities who have been historically privileged, who have monopolized state power, who have monopolized state administration. And it was against this monopolization, it was essentially against this monopolization of certain communities, who we understand as the quote-unquote upper castes in this country, against whose monopoly and dominance in public administration came into being this provision for reservation of the backward classes. So it was not a caste-blind provision. We need to understand that when we talk about sharing of state power, we first have to acknowledge that historically, socially, and systematically, certain communities have monopolized state power. And these are the upper castes, right? What the EWS provision essentially does is it gives you a sense or a feeling on the face of it, prima facie, that it is a caste-blind provision. Now, I'm sure Mr. Mohan Gopal must have already talked about it and explained it in detail, that EWS is essentially a provision of reservations for upper castes. And there are no two ways to it. You look at the entire wording of the article, Article 16.6 and Article 15.6 that were brought by the 103rd Amendment. They're completely caste neutral and caste blind. But they exclude the SC, ST, OBC communities, right? So it is essentially a provision that provides, that gives reservations to the upper castes, to the economic weaker, of course, from the upper castes. Now, one will have to understand that when we say that there has been, and it's not me who is saying this is 9 judges in the Indira Sahni case, which is the original reservations case, where a majority of 9 judges have said that the object of Article 16.4 is to do away with the monopolization of state power by the upper castes. So it's only reiterating what has already been said in the Constituent Assembly debates, right? And when you come up with a provision, a newer provision within the Constitution, using the Constitution making amending power provided within the Constitution, to come up with a provision that only reiterates, that reproduces this kind of monopolization of upper castes through the EWS quota. EWS quota meaning the upper caste quota. What you are doing is you are entrenching the monopoly and the dominance of the communities who have already had a proper look-in into the administration. In fact, not just a proper look-in, but they are overrepresented in all sectors, all the mainstream sectors of public life, right? So what you are doing is You are reversing the very idea of democracy. The idea of democracy, which talks about equal participation, you are reversing that. You are saying that those who have dominated all walks of life, now the state, by way of a constitutional provision, will guarantee that you keep that monopoly intact, that you keep that dominance intact. And this, in a sense,
Ma'am, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. I think you are on a mute mode.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, now you are audible. Please continue. And ma'am, 5 more minutes.
Where did you lose? Yeah, where did you lose me?
Just 1 minute before. You just continue.
Yeah?
Ma'am, 5 minutes more.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So like I was saying, that it is unthinkable in any liberal constitutional democracy where the privileged and those who dominate all walks of life, of public life, have been privileged by the Constitution, have been further privileged by the Constitution. And it has become a constitutional guarantee. EWS reservations, mind you, is a part of the Constitution now. And it is a constitutionally sanctioned provision which is privileging the already privileged and the monopolized. And in that sense, it is in essence, a constitutionally kosher provision. It is a constitutionally orthodox provision. It is ushering in a pre-constitutional era, the era that Babasaheb warned us against. He spoke about this undemocratic soil, right? And today, by way of EWS reservation provision in the Constitution, we are using the same constitutional language to actually usher in a pre-constitutional era. The other aspect I wanted to discuss, and because I just have 5 minutes, is to just speak about how critical race scholars and critical legal scholars have articulated law in itself. And it is important for us to understand the context in which the EWS reservation, or this demand for EWS reservation, and this resounding demand for EWS reservations, where is it coming from? We've had 75 years of successful run of reservations for the backward classes in this country. We need to understand that as critical race scholars, as Black scholars, African American scholars, they've argued that law, in a sense, tries to maintain or has a tendency to maintain the status quo. It is the very nature of law to collude with power, right? And in that sense, when you have any kind of progress in law or any kind of progressive step that is taken in law, it is bound to meet with a reaction. And it is bound to meet with a reaction from reactionary forces who do not want the status quo to change, who do not want the dominance of the upper castes to change, who have a stake and a claim in the caste system, who privilege from that system, right? So it is in the very nature of law to meet with these kind of reactions. It is in this context that we will have to understand that this resounding demand of EWS reservations is coming in after a successful run of reservations for 75 years. And it is just unthinkable that our constitution, which was a radical document of change, of bringing about change, of annihilating these systems and these structures of inequality, is now being used. That document itself is being used to undo what it was meant to do, to go back on it, to reverse what the Constitution sought to do. So, and this has been seen in the case of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And Black scholars have argued that 13th Amendment, though it abolished slavery, it did not end there. Slavery didn't end there. There were newer laws that were brought in, the new Jim Crow era laws that were brought in to criminalize Black communities and to ensure that though there is not the standard form of slavery that is being followed, but they were being put into jails and the same system of slavery was being continued, right? So law tends to do this. Law tends to reproduce the systemic hierarchies and the systemic inequalities. And any resistance to that, any progress made in the law is bound to meet with this reaction. I would just like to conclude by saying that the Constitution, being the radical document that it is, now we are entering an era where EWS reservation needs to be seen not just as an attack on reservations, but an attack on, and a very successful attack at that, on the very idea of the Constitution, the Indian Constitution, the democratic Constitution that we were given, right? And our fights in courts are important. Our confrontations in courts are important, and interventions are important. But just that will not suffice. I think the social movements are indispensable to ensure that this mockery of the Constitution in the form of EWS reservations, it's just the beginning of it. But this mockery of the Constitution is going to continue, and we will have to confront it with all might and fight, not just in the courts, because there are certain limitations in terms of law, but that fight will have to continue through our social movement, through political movement. I think we will have to be prepared. And I'd just like to conclude with what one of the judges in the EWS judgment, the Janhit Abhiyan judgment, observed. He said that, because, and I'm saying this because a lot of us tend to think that, well, EWS reservations is not going to impact the backward classes reservations. And I think I would like to bust that myth. One of the judges, Justice Pardiwala, has observed that EWS reservations is necessary and it's essential because it is the first step in doing away or in eradicating caste-based reservations. It will have to be seen as the first step towards ending caste-based reservations. So in its very essence, the idea of EWS reservations, let us not be diverted, and let us focus on what is important. EWS reservation has come to do away with caste-based reservation. This is the very first step. And one of the judges has actually put that in the judgment. I think I will end on that. And thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, ma'am. I would request Sushma Bhad, madam, to please felicitate Dr. Disha Wadekar by presenting a memento and bouquet online. Thank you so much, ma'am. I would request Sushma Bhad, madam, chairperson for the session 5, that is issues related to EWS reservation, to please sum up the session.
घटनेचे शिल्पकार विश्वरत्न डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर आणि समस्त महामानवांना अभिवादन करते. समस्त उपस्थित गणमान्य मान्यवर सर्वांना माझा सप्रेम जय भीम, जय ओबीसी, जय सावित्री, जय जिजाऊ. EWS आरक्षण वरती आता डॉक्टर मोहन गोपाल सर आणि दिव्या मॅमनी जे आपल्यासमोर एक त्याच्यावरती प्रेझेंटेशन केलेलं आहे, त्याच्यातून त्यांनी हेच म्हटलं आहे की हे लोकशाहीचं उल्लंघन ठरतं, संविधानाचं उल्लंघन ठरतं. आणि त्यातून एक लक्षात येतं की कुठलीही जनगणना न होता, जनगणना न करता, कुठलाही डेटा कलेक्ट न करता, मागच्या डोरनी कुठलीही मागणी नाही, आंदोलन नाही, काही नाही, अशा प्रकारचं हे EWS आरक्षण हे अप्पर कास्ट म्हणजे उच्चवर्णीय लोकांसाठी त्यांना अजून पॉवरफुल बनवण्यासाठी त्यांच्या हातात मिळालेलं एक त्यांनी 103वी घटना दुरुस्ती करून आणि त्याच्यामध्ये 15(6) आणि 16(6) या 2 आर्टिकलमध्ये बदल करून ते घटनादत्त करून घेतलेलं आहे. आणि त्याच्यामुळे त्याच्यातून पुन्हा त्यांनी जे OBC SC ST या सर्वांना त्यांनी बाहेर काढलेलं आहे. त्याच्यामध्ये ऑलरेडी त्यांनी हे म्हटलं की बा त्याच्यामध्ये यांना ऑलरेडी रिझर्वेशन दिलेलं असल्यामुळं त्यांना त्या EWSमध्ये त्यांना समाविष्ट केलेलं नाही. ही पण या इथल्या म्हणजे मोहन गोपाल सरांनी हे म्हटलं की जेव्हा रिस्पॉन्सिबल जे लोकप्रतिनिधी असतात ते आपण त्या संसदेत पाठवत नाही आणि हे रिस्पॉन्सिबल नसल्यामुळं त्यांनी एक मोनोपल्ली सारखा या संविधानाला एक छेद देण्याचा प्रकार केलेला आहे, तो कुणालाही मान्य नाही. ॲक्च्युली कुठलंही आता OBCचं 1931मध्ये इंग्रजांनी जनगणना केली होती आणि त्याच्या आधारावरती जेव्हा 340 आर्टिकल 340 हे OBCसाठी लिहिलं, 341 SCसाठी आणि 342 STसाठी, असं असताना त्याच्यामध्ये त्याचं शेड्युलिंग केलं गेलं SC आणि STचं, पण OBCचं आजपर्यंत जनगणना न केल्यामुळं त्याला पूर्ण आरक्षणाचा आजपर्यंत लाभ मिळालेला नाही. म्हणजे 27% आरक्षणापैकी केवळ 19% आरक्षण OBCना मिळालं आणि त्याच्यात क्रिमिलेअरची अट टाकल्यामुळं केवळ 4% आरक्षण OBC इतक्या वर्षापासून 75 वर्षापासून अव्हेल करतो आहे. याची आमच्या राज्यकर्त्यांना कधीही म्हणजे जो सगळ्यात मोठा लार्जेस्ट जो हे आहे त्याच्या आरक्षणासाठी सगळ्या सोशल मुवमेंट सगळे OBC लोक सातत्याने पाठपुरावा करत आहे. मंडल आयोगानंतर ह्या पाठपुरावा करण्यात आला, परंतु कोणीही ती गोष्ट मनीध्यानी न घेता आजपर्यंत त्यांचं जे घटनादत्त आरक्षण आहे ते देण्यास कुचराई केली आणि त्यांना ते दिलं नाही, त्यांना वंचित ठेवलं आणि त्यांची आज अधोगती होताना दिसते आहे. परंतु हे 10% आरक्षण विदाऊट डिमांड आणि विदाऊट सेन्सस हे मंजूर करून घेतलं, हे संविधानिक असू शकते काय? याच्यावर सगळ्यांनीच खरं म्हणजे एक ही जी मोनोपल्ली आहे आणि केवळ पर्टिक्युलर लोकांना जे सोशली आणि एज्युकेशनली जे बॅकवर्ड नाही आहे. ॲक्च्युली कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन काय म्हणतं, डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकरांचं कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन म्हणतं की सोशली आणि एज्युकेशनली जे बॅकवर्ड आहे त्यांना हे आरक्षण, त्यांचं प्रतिनिधित्व, त्यांचा हक्क दिला पाहिजे. परंतु हे सोशली एज्युकेशनली कधीच बॅकवर्ड नव्हते, अशा लोकांना EWSचं आरक्षण देणं म्हणजे पर्टिक्युलर लोकांना अजून पॉवरफुल करून तुमच्या छाताडावर नाचवणं हा एक प्रकार सगळ्या ठिकाणी होणार आहे. म्हणून या आरक्षणामुळं कोणाच म्हणजे जे बाकीचे जे बहुजन आहे, बहुजनांना याच्यापासून त्याचा समावेश न केल्यामुळं ते वंचित राहतात आणि 8 लाखाचं जे त्यांनी मर्यादा घातलेली आहे की 8 लाखाचं पर्यंत त्यांना ज्यांचं उत्पन्न आहे आणि 5 एकर जमीन आहे असे लोक ते अव्हेल करू शकतात. ॲक्च्युली हे सर जवळपास मला वाटतं करोना चालू असताना हे सगळं संस्थांमध्ये लागू झालं. फक्त त्याचा जो गवगवा जो आहे तो आपल्याला आता होताना दिसतो आहे, परंतु प्रत्यक्ष त्याचे GR सगळ्या संस्थांमध्ये सर्क्युलेट झालेले होते आणि ते त्याप्रमाणे ॲडमिशन पण झाल्या आणि म्हणजे आता त्याप्रमाणे त्यांना नोकऱ्या आणि शैक्षणिक संस्थांमध्ये हे सगळं आरक्षण मिळाल्यामुळं तो पर्टिक्युलर जो क्लास आहे तो म्हणजे अनकॉन्स्टिट्युशनली याच्यावरती त्यांनी आता ह्या दोन्ही जे इथे जे मार्गदर्शक होते त्यांनी सांगितलं की बा हे डेमोक्रेसीचं हे व्हायलेशन आहे. त्याच्यामुळं सर्वांनी आता आपल्याला कुठेतरी या EWSसाठी अनेकांनी त्याच्यावरती प्रतिक्रिया दिलेल्या आहे किंवा आणि ते घटनेतच आता दुरुस्ती केल्यामुळं आणि 5 जजेसचा बेंच होता त्याच्यामध्ये 2 जजेसनी त्याला मनाई केली 3 वर्सेस 2 अशीची सिच्युएशन होती. अशाच याच्यामध्ये ते मंजूर करून घेण्यात आलं. आणि या पद्धतीचं जर या लोकशाही देशामध्ये होत असेल तर मला असं वाटतं म्हणजे उद्याच्या धोक्याची जी घंटा आहे ती आपल्या म्हणजे अजून असे काही अमेंडमेंट असतील, जसं मागे किसानांचा कायदा झाला, अशा अनेक जे लॉज आहे ज्याच्यामध्ये म्हणजे कोणालाही माहीत नव्हता ते अमेंडमेंट केल्या जातात. NRCचा मुद्दा होता. असे अनेक मुद्दे आहे की ज्याच्यामुळे तुम्हाला तुमच्या याच्यापासून जगण्यापासून वंचित केलं जाते, म्हणजे राईट टू लाईफपासून तुम्हाला वंचित केला जात आहे आणि तुमच्यापासून सगळं हिसकावून घेण्याचं आणि गुलामगिरीकडे नेण्याचं एक प्रकारचं त्यांनी सत्ता म्हणजे ते टूल वापरून त्या पद्धतीने व्हायलेशन होताना दिसते. म्हणून सर्वांनी जागरूक राहून डोळ्यात तेल घालून या बाबींचा सर्वांनी विरोध करायला पाहिजे. त्यासाठी सर्वांनी एकत्रित होणं, सर्व बहुजनांनी एकत्रित होऊन ही लढाई लढली पाहिजे. एवढं मी आपणासमोर मी आव्हान करते. थांबते. जय भीम, जय OBC, जय जिजाऊ, जय सावित्री.
थँक्यू मॅम. I request Professor Vidya Chor Pragar to please felicitate Sushma Bhad madam. आपण आज जे सन्मान्य व्यक्तींचा सत्कार केलेला आहे त्यापैकी आणखी 2 व्यक्ती आपल्यामध्ये आलेले आहेत. त्यांना पण मी मंचावर बोलवू इच्छिते. मिसेस सुगंधा खांडेकर यांनी महिला करिता खूप समाजकार्यात योगदान दिलेले आहे. मी डॉक्टर विमल थोरात यांना विनंती करते की त्यांनी सुगंधा खांडेकर मॅडमचं सन्मान करावा. सुगंधा खांडेकर मॅडम. याचबरोबर आपल्यासोबत समीक्षा गणवीर मॅडम पण आहे. त्यांनी गोसेखुर्दग्रस्तांकरिता खूप मोठे कार्य केलेले आहे. त्यांना पण मी मंचावर आमंत्रित करते. मला वाटतं समीक्षा गणवीर मॅडम नाही आहेत आपल्याकडे. Thank you, ma'am. Now I request Chairperson for the session 4, that is issues related to women, Honorable Kalpana Meshram, to please sum up the session.
आमचे प्रेरणास्थान महामानव डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर, आरक्षणाचे जनक शाहू महाराज आणि आजच्या या आरक्षण परिषदेच्या निमित्ताने इथे जमलेले मान्यवर आणि प्रबुद्ध नागरिकांना, आज चौथं जे सत्र झालेलं आहे ते महिलांच्या समस्या आणि त्याचे वक्ते होते सुभासिनी अली मॅडम आणि विमल थोरात मॅडम यांनी महिलांच्या संसदेमध्ये आणि पंचायत राजमध्ये जे महिलांना रिझर्वेशन मिळालेलं आहे आणि तिथल्या ज्या काही समस्या आहेत त्यावर त्यांनी इथे मार्गदर्शन केलेलं आहे. आणि त्या ज्या समस्या आहेत त्या पुरुषी व्यवस्थेतून, पुरुषी मानसिकतेतून जे 33% रिझर्वेशनचं जे बिल माघारलेलं आहे त्यावर त्यांनी प्रकाश टाकलेला आहे. जगातील सर्व समाजामध्ये स्त्रीचे अस्तित्व महत्त्वाचे आहे, तिच्याशिवाय पर्याय नाही, असे उर्दू कवी आलम इक्बाल यांनी म्हटलेलं आहे. जगभरामध्येच आपल्याला स्त्री पुरुष समानता दिसून येत नाही आणि त्यामुळे स्त्रियांच्या जीवनात अनेक मूलभूत समस्या निर्माण होतात आणि सर्व समस्यांचं मूळ हे या मानसिकतेत दडलेलं आहे. पंचायत राजमध्ये जे रिझर्वेशन मिळते आहे त्यामध्ये अनेक स्त्रिया आमच्या निवडून येतात, सरपंच होतात आणि पण त्यांना निर्णय घेण्याचं पूर्णपणे स्वातंत्र्य नसतं. त्यांच्या घरचे पुरुष त्यांच्या वतीने निर्णय घेत असतात. ही निर्णय क्षमता डेव्हलप होण्यासाठी, तिची सामर्थ्य क्षमता बघण्यासाठी तिला निर्णय घेण्याचं स्वातंत्र्य असावं आणि तिला या दुय्यम स्थानातून मुक्त करावं, म्हणजे इथल्या ज्या मूळ समस्या आहेत त्या कमी व्हायला मदत होईल. प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये एक सुभाषिनी अली मॅडमनी सांगितलं की प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये सुद्धा जे नोकरीमधून कमी करण्याचं प्रमाण आहे त्यामध्ये सर्वात आधी जर कुणावर कुऱ्हाड ओढवत असेल तर ती महिलांवर असते, त्यांना आधी काढलं जातं. तर त्यांनी एक मागणी अशी करायला लावली की प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये सुद्धा रिझर्वेशन मिळालं पाहिजे, यासाठी आपल्याला आवाज उठवावा लागेल. आजच्या या परिषदेचा, या वर्कशॉप आज जे दिवसभर होते आहे त्याचा जो उद्देश आहे की आरक्षण हे आम्हाला कोणत्या कोणत्या क्षेत्रात कशा पद्धतीने चाललेलं आहे आणि आम्हाला पुढे काय करायचं आहे. महिलांच्या संदर्भामध्ये विमल थोरात मॅडम आणि सुभाषिनी अली मॅडम यांनी जे 33% रिझर्वेशनवर जो हे प्रकाश टाकलेला आहे, आमची 50%, आम्ही समाजामध्ये 50% संख्येने जरी असलो तरी आम्हाला 33% रिझर्वेशनसुद्धा मिळण्यासाठी इतकी वाट बघावी लागत आहे. तर हे लवकरात लवकर याचा निर्णय व्हायला पाहिजे आणि महिलांना त्यांचा अर्धा हिस्सा, अर्धा हक्क मिळाला पाहिजे. एवढेच मी बोलते आणि थांबते.
थँक्यू मॅम. I would request Professor Gautam Kamble to please felicitate Honorable Kalpana Mishram ma'am. So now we have, here we come to the end of session 4 and session 5. Thank you. We have with us Mr. Martin Makwana from Gujarat, who has manufactured this coin, which we have given to felicitate our social workers. So I would request Martin Makwana sir. Sir, can you hear me? Sir, I think you are mute. Please unmute yourself. Yes, you are audible. Yes, sir. Please, please start.
गुड इवनिंग एवरीवन. जय भीम. मुझे प्रोफेसर थोराट साहब ने बोला था कि मैं 5-7 मिनट के लिए आ जाऊँ ये बात करने के लिए कि कॉइन हमने क्यों बनाया था. तो मुझे लग रहा है कि कॉइन आपके हाथ में है और आप देख सकते हैं कि कॉइन पे एक सवाल रखा गया है. 1947 का छुआछूत मुक्त भारत का सपना 2047 में साकार होगा क्या? आज़ादी के 75 साल हो गए और छुआछूत अभी बरकरार है, इतना नहीं मजबूत हो रही है. तो हमने ये सिक्का बनाया था सरकार का ध्यान आकर्षित करने के लिए, क्योंकि बहुत बड़े जश्न से मनाया जा रहा था आज़ादी के 75 साल. आज़ादी के बाद ये संवैधानिक जिम्मेदारी थी पार्लियामेंट की कि छुआछूत को नाबूद करे। जितना काम इस क्षेत्र में आज़ादी के पहले हुआ या आज़ादी के तुरंत बाद हुआ, वो अभी बिल्कुल दिख नहीं रहा है। विकास की जो भी चर्चाएं हो रही है, इसमें छुआछूत का मुद्दा कहीं नहीं आ रहा है। तो हमने बनाया था सिक्का, लोगों को हमने बोला कि घर घर से लोग चंदा दे, तो करीब 2,500 किलो बर्तन पित्तल के लोगों ने अपने घरों से दिए थे 14 स्टेट से। इसमें से ये 1100 किलो का सिक्का बना है। साथ में हमने बोला था कि हम पार्लियामेंट को डोनेशन भी देंगे। लोकशाही में ऐसा होता नहीं ज़्यादातर कि लोग पार्लियामेंट को डोनेशन दे। हमने बोला हम देंगे क्योंकि हम भिखारी लोग नहीं हैं, हम आपको कुछ दे सकते हैं, तो हम देंगे। तो ये इसका इस्तेमाल करिए ये पैसे का, और आप छुआछूत निकालिए। तो हमने कैंपेन शुरू किया कि हर घर में से एक सदस्य दीठ 1 रुपये का सिक्का दे दो। तो पूरे कैंपेन के दौरान हमारे पास 21 लाख से ज़्यादा सिक्के आ गए। तो 1000 किलो का बड़ा सिक्का और 21 लाख सिक्के के 3 ट्रक भर के हम 1 अगस्त को अहमदाबाद से निकले थे यात्रा में दिल्ली के लिए। आप सब ने देखा होगा अखबारों में, हरियाणा बॉर्डर पे रोका गया कि हमें बहुत क्लियर इंस्ट्रक्शन है होम मिनिस्ट्री का कि आपको जहां हो वहां रोक देना है। लेकिन इतना प्रचंड माहौल मैंने मेरे 42 साल की करियर में नहीं देखा है। 12 बजे तक लोग, बच्चे, महिलाएं राजस्थान के गांवों में अंधेरे में इंतज़ार करते हैं कि सिक्का आ रहा है। तो जो लोगों को छुआछूत से पीड़ा हो रहा है, ये लोग तो तैयार है इसके खिलाफ लड़ने के लिए। लेकिन मैं देख रहा हूँ कि हमारे जो शिक्षित लोग हैं, सरकारी नौकरी वाले लोग हैं, जिसको हम ऑर्गेनाइज क्लास बोलते हैं, ये लोग इतना हिस्सा नहीं ले रहे हैं। ये मैंने 42 साल की मेरी करियर में देखा है। कॉलेज ख़त्म करके इस एक क्षेत्र में आया था और अभी तक रहा हूँ। ये आपसे बहुत चर्चा करेंगे आइडियोलॉजिकल, लेकिन आंदोलन में जुड़ेंगे नहीं। लेकिन मैं मानता हूँ कि जैसे हमारे जो भी हमारे सामाजिक क्रांति के हमारे आइडल्स हो चुके हैं इतिहास में, उन्होंने बोला था कि इंसान के पास इज्जत नहीं होता है, सम्मान नहीं होता है, तो डेमोक्रेसी में उसका कोई मूल्य नहीं होता है। हमारे संविधान में इसलिए राइट टू लाइफ आर्टिकल 21 विद डिग्निटी है। अब ये कौन सी डिग्निटी? अब गुजरात में तो मैंने अध्ययन किया, गुजरात, महाराष्ट्र, राजस्थान और हरियाणा 4 स्टेट में पिछले 5 साल में करीब 85 घटनाएं हुई है कि दूल्हे को घोड़े पर से उतार दिया है जाति को लेकर। और हमने देखा कि राजस्थान में जयपुर शहर में दलित आईपीएस ऑफिसर की शादी में वो घोड़े पर तब बैठ पाए जब पुलिस रक्षण उसको दिया गया। तो हम ये समझ में नहीं आ रहा है कि ये बर्दाश्त लोग क्यों कर रहे हैं। ये तो हम तो इसमें लगे हुए हैं बहुत सालों से, बड़ा संगठन भी है। तो ये पहली बार भारत के इतिहास में इतना बड़ा हमने इस सिक्के के माध्यम से सवाल उठाया। जो हरियाणा बॉर्डर पे रोका गया, हम तो 350 लोग थे, उसमें से 100 महिलाएं थी और पुलिस फोर्स तो 1000 के ऊपर था। स्टैंड गन्स लेके, फायर वज्र व्हीकल्स, बोल्डर्स बड़े बड़े, वाटर कैनन्स। हमने बोला भाई हम कुछ मांगने नहीं है, हम तो देने आए आप लोग को। नहीं नहीं साहब, आप जाएंगे दिल्ली में तो धमाल हो सकता है, तो एक काम करिए ना, हम नहीं जा रहे दिल्ली, आप सरकार को बोलिए यहाँ जहाँ आप हमें रोक रहे हो वहाँ आके सिक्का ले लो, हम तो आपको सिर्फ देना चाहते हैं। लेकिन इस सिक्का लोग सरकार को डरा गया है। लेकिन मुझे ये बात भी कहनी है, ये जो सिक्का आपके पास है वो हमने भारत के सभी पार्लियामेंट के मेंबर्स को दिया है, घर घर जाके दिया है, राज्यसभा और लोकसभा दोनों में दिया है। मुझे एक भी दलित एमपी का अभी तक ना तो लेटर आया है ना तो फोन आया है कि आपने अच्छा काम किया है, हमारा इसमें आपको समर्थन है। मुझे भाजपा के 2 लोगों की चिट्ठी आई और फोन भी आया, एक उत्तराखंड से और एक राजस्थान से, कि मार्टिन भाई हमारे जो भी आइडियोलॉजिकल डिफरेंस हो सकता है लेकिन ये अभूतपूर्व आंदोलन है और हम मानते हैं कि ये तो मजबूत होना चाहिए। तो आज़ादी के 75 साल में हमारे इतने सारे मेंबर ऑफ पार्लियामेंट बैठे हैं, ऑलमोस्ट मोर देन 80, लेकिन छुआछूत आज भी चालू है। दलित प्रेसिडेंट हो सकता है लेकिन छुआछूत चालू रहता है। दलित प्रेसिडेंट बन सकता है, हाई कोर्ट सुप्रीम कोर्ट के जज बन सकते हैं, चीफ जस्टिस बन सकते हैं, लेकिन मैनुअल स्कैवेंजिंग चालू रहेगा। तो हमने ये मुद्दा हमारे दलित एजेंडा में नहीं जोड़ा है कहीं इतना जोर से कि सरकार पर उसका कुछ प्रभाव पड़े। तो मैं बस बहुत कुछ नहीं कहना चाहता हूँ, आपने मुझे याद किया, मैं आपका धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूँ। और मैं आशा रखता हूँ कि छुआछूत की जो बात है वो हमें गंभीरता से लेनी चाहिए और ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा लोग जुड़ने चाहिए। हमने तो सरकार को बोला है कि हम 24 के पहले अगली बार आएंगे, एक बार और शायद आपको ये 20 लाख 21 लाख कॉइन कम पड़े, अगली बार शायद कोशिश करते 1 करोड़ कॉइन लेके आते। तो ये मेरे 4-5 मिनट के छोटे रिमार्क्स थे। I thank the organizers for remembering me on this occasion and I wish all of you all the best. Thank you so much. Jai Bhim.
Thank you so much, sir. Let us move on to the next session, the last session of this conference, policies for discriminated groups. The chairperson for this session is not available due to some unavoidable reasons. So I would request the speakers to please come on the dais. Dr. Amit Thorat, he's from Center for the Study of Regional Development, JNU, New Delhi. I would request Dr. Amit Thorat to please come up on the stage. And another speaker with us is Dr. Anurag Bhaskar, Assistant Professor, Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat. He would be joining us online. Sir, I would request you to please deliver your talk. Yeah. Maybe he'll be joining online.
Good evening and Jai Bhim to all. First of all, I'd like to thank the Federation of Organization for Social Justice, Secularism and Democracy and the Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Research and Training Institute to invite me and pay for my airfare, which is not a mean task these days, post-COVID and in recession. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about something which is based on a study I did at the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies. And it was funded by a German research organization because no one else will have the courage to fund it. And it's something which is new. we have had a whole day of discussion on reservations. And with the EWS reservation, the entire idea of why reservation came in has changed. And as Dr. Mohan very eloquently and in quite detail told us, the origins of the idea of reservation and how they are being changed. The lawyer, Miss or Mrs. I don't know, Wadekar also talked about how we are going to pre-constitutional times. So I'm going to talk about that pre-constitutional time actually. And from there I'm going to talk about a policy of reparations. Many of you know about reparations, but it is something I and Professor Thorat, we were part of a consultation on the idea of reparations at Harvard. And there were 10 groups, there were 10 people, 10 groups representing 10 different marginalized communities from all over the world who came together and who were trying to talk about compensation. And it was quite an experience because there were representatives who were taking the case of, say, the descendants of the African American slave trade, or people talking about the Native Americans and the indigenous Canadian tribes, people talking about the Roma communities, who are Indians who have left in the 13th century and are discriminated in Europe, the Congolese people who were ruled by the Belgian king and suffered heinous atrocities, the slave trade of Caribbean islands, women. There were lawyers who were asking for reparation and compensation for women who have suffered severe violence and suffering during conflict and war, and similarly other groups. And we were representing the case of the Dalits. And we then started thinking that the only policy that everyone talks about and is seen as a savior for the Dalits, tribals, Adivasis, Bahujans is reservation. And you look around yourself, you'll find you're the second or maximum, I don't find any third generation. Third generation is now coming up who are recipients of reservation. Without reservation, it's impossible to imagine participation in the state. You know, my father tells stories of being in a village and being chased by upper caste people. I tried getting into the university I studied in 4 times, but I was excluded, finally got in the 4th attempt in JNU. And this is when with reservation. So you can imagine if there is no reservation, there is no representation. One shudders to think that. And this is what we see as the policy which takes us forward. But I want to talk about what about the 2,500 years of untouchability and caste enslavement, which we really don't, we know about it, but we don't talk about it. And that is what I'm going to talk about. Why do we need to now start thinking about reparations? If what Wadekar was saying is that this is just the beginning, and she said that the judge has made that statement in the judgment that this is the first step in doing away with caste-based reservation, then you can imagine what new steps and laws will come to completely do away with caste-based reservations. If that is the case, then we have to start thinking of additional policy mechanisms, which also puts pressure and creates an environment for them to rethink that, oh, do we do away with reservation? Then what about if reparation comes, then what do we do? So maybe we should have to keep reservation. Maybe reparations, we can't give reparations. We don't want to give reparations. So we'll have to give something. So we have to now start thinking about reparations as a very credible and policy alternative, which also acts as a pressure on the government. Now, what is reparations? Many of you know about it. Why should we ask Dalits or other marginalized groups ask for reparations? Why do they need or deserve reparations? And what do I mean when I say reparation? And how it is different from compensation and restitution? So if you imagine at the time of independence, where all the constitutional debates happen, Dr. Ambedkar is trying to write in and bring in all kinds of, policy measures for the marginalized groups. He manages to bring in a reservation in education and state employment and legislation to give them a representation. But at the time of independence, what is the situation of the marginalized groups? What do they inherit from 2000 years, from Vedic period, post-Vedic period, medieval period, Mughal period, and British period? What is their history? What is that they have to show for themselves at the time of independence? So this is the study we did, and we dependent on historic studies. And there are some of the work which has been done is done by historians, and pretty good work based on original texts. So works based on the Vedas, Upanishads, Brahmanas, Smritis, Dharma Sutras, Ramayana, Mahabharata, you can go on. And you look at the original text and see and try and figure out what was the society like. And there is evidence, a lot of evidence there. So we found a lot of studies which look at the Vedic and the post-Vedic period, where you find that in the beginning, caste or Varna Vyavastha or the ideology of Chatur Varna was theoretical, but people were mixing, they were intermarrying, there was occupational mobility, all that is happening. And it is during the time of probably the Gupta period where, there is contestation in history about whether Kautilya was ex or not, but from whatever available literature we have, it is Kautilya who becomes kind of the advisor for the Guptas, and then the entire theoretical system of caste and Brahmanism is then implemented per force in the governance and administration. So you have caste-based occupation, you have endogamy by caste, you don't have occupational mobility, and all that you know and understand as caste hierarchy, graded hierarchy, starts during that period. And from then on, when you look at studies, PhD thesis, books, etc., done by scholars in history, understanding caste and slavery, what we forget, and I think it's something we have to start thinking about, is caste slavery. So there are two new books, one by Dr. Sanal Mohan and another by Dr. Vishwanathan, which talk about caste slavery, which is basically subcastes within the Shudras or untouchables, like the Parayas, the Pulayas, and others, were born as caste slaves, and many of you know this. And their families are born as slaves. And it is only when the British come, and in 1783, that they officially, legally ban caste slavery in India. So you must understand, till 1783, there was caste slavery happening in India, properly. You are born into a slave caste, and you are a slave of your owner. So when we look at history and we try and find out research done based on original text or secondary text or archival material, we find nothing through the medieval period, the Mughal period. The Mughals came here, they made India their home, but they understood that this is a hierarchy, and they also had a big labor force, the Shudra labor force, which they used. So they had no vested interest in changing caste society. Whoever converted was welcome into Islam. Even the conversion is caste-based. So if you are a Brahmin or upper caste, then you are given the title of Sheikh Sayyid Khan Pathan, which is upper, superior Muslim names. But if you are a middle caste, low caste, then you are an Ansari or a Qureshi and all that. So there is a hierarchy within the Indian Muslim community, because they converted from their original caste hierarchies, which the Muslim scholars are not very comfortable agreeing, but there are new young people who are working on that. So you find caste in Islam in India as well. But the Mughal rulers did not try to break caste. And then the Britishers come. And Britishers actually appoint a Brahmin priest in their courts. The Anglo-Indian law, which they brought to India, they appoint a Brahmin priest. And we have documentary evidence because the Britishers were meticulous documenters, right? They did cadastral surveys and they had documents, and you have historical records. Recently, some documents have been released. I was watching on Al Jazeera yesterday, and they find how the British were actually torturing the Kenyan. Kenya was a colony, and how any atrocities that were done in Kenya were completely sidelined by the British law system there, and the documents have been revealed. So they were great, and we can find these documents, I'm sure, in the British archive. And we have found documents like they set up commissions. So a labor commission found that, so they wanted to see who works in India and what is the labor system which they needs to change or modify. And the labor commission says that most agrestic work, agricultural work, is done by caste slaves. They are called agrestic caste slaves. Most of South, Eastern, and Western India, and must be elsewhere. So when the abolitionist movement happened in UK, back in England, that there was demand for banning slavery. So the British were one of the biggest colonizers of the world, and they had slaves coming in from all over the world. And there was a movement within UK that no, slavery is against Christianity, it's anti-Catholic ethos. So slavery was banned in UK back in at least around 1770s, early 70s. So they should have banned caste slavery in India at the same time. But they took another 10 years, till 83, to ban caste slavery in India, because most of the labor, agricultural work, was done by caste slaves in India, low caste untouchable slaves. And agriculture was one of the biggest sources of revenue for the British and the empire. First as East India Company, and then as the colonial, as the British Empire. So they took 10 years to abolish it. Finally, they abolished it. Till then, all matters related to slavery, marriage, etc., were all dealt by a Pandit sitting in the court of the British judiciary in India. So they did nothing to abolish slavery. So they also owe us reparations for the time till 873 they were here. Now, the idea of reparation is not new. Many countries have given reparation to a lot of victims, mostly in Latin America, some in Africa. But these are basically compensations and reparations given to victims of, say, war or a dictatorship. Like in Peru or Chile or Argentina, you have a dictator who comes in and he kills hundreds and thousands of people, jails them, kidnapping, rape, whatever. And then a democracy comes. And then there is a council set up to look at these war crimes, and there are compensations given. The Jews were given compensation after the Holocaust. Germany paid compensation to them. In the Second World War, when Japan attacked USA and they bombed Pearl Harbor, the American got suspicious of all the Japanese in America. There were a lot of people came to America from all over the world to settle, not just white man, Chinese, Japanese, Pacific Islanders, all over the world. So when Japan attacked America, the Japanese population in America was rounded up and thrown into so-called isolation. They were kind of, जिसे कह सकते हैं nazarband, not prisoned but nazarband. They went to court and they got $30,000. Each family got $30,000 as compensation, as reparations. There are many cases of reparations all over the world, so it is not new. And one of the oldest and strongest demand for reparations is by the descendants of the African American slaves. The African men and women who were kidnapped from Africa, brought on slave ships and sold in America to work on cotton farms and plantation. and were killed and hanged and not paid any wages. That is the worst kind of, one of the worst kind of slaveries we know of. Their descendants are asking for reparation. And the first demand was done in almost 18th century by one lawyer, I forget his name, of $3 trillion. And that has been continuing till now. And now we see a lot of the church, the Catholic Church of America has promised $100 million to the African American community. They have collected $10 million. Many of the universities in America, Harvard, Georgetown, and many others, were actually founded by entrepreneurs or privateers who gave money to found these universities, who were actually slave traders themselves. So all these temples of egalitarian intellectual thought in America, the universities, are actually founded on slave money. And Harvard recently did a commission on it itself. They set up a commission, and they found that a large part of the donation to Harvard came from a person who sold slaves, was a slave trader, and donated that money. So they have now constituted a fellowship or a program of equivalent sum of money to be given to African American students. So a lot of institutions, religious, academic, and others are coming forward to basically say that if a community was historically excluded, discriminated violently, then they need to be compensated for that harm, which happened in spirit but not in word when Lincoln abolished racial slavery. When Lincoln abolished slavery, he made a proclamation that every black family would be given 4 acres and a mule, 4 acres of land and a mule, which is like a donkey. Because if you are no more a slave, how do you earn your living? How do you start, what do you earn and what do you eat? So land should be given to them, a mule should be given to them, they can grow their food and etc., which never happened. Some people got it and it was taken back. But my point here is when the caste enslaved of India, when caste slavery was abolished legally by the British in 1873, there must be thousands and thousands, if not millions of people who were slaves of their masters for thousands of generations, for hundreds of generations. They have nothing. They have no human rights, they have no civil rights, they have no political rights, they have no social rights, they own no land, wealth, asset, no house, nothing. You're actually like an animal. They used to live with the animals. They're expected to live and also plow fields with the bullocks. So they were worse than animals. So when you ban slavery, what do? How do they earn their living? And there is no mention of any reparation or compensation by the British government. So they continue to work with their masters, what we call as indentured labor, bonded labor, attached labor, which has been analyzed and studied just post-independence by a lot of economists, that we have bonded labor, attached labor. These are basically ex-slavers. Now, you don't compensate them for anything. They have nothing. No cultural capital, no education, no social capital, don't know how to speak, talk. And now you suddenly want them to compete? Be meritorious? Okay, you have reservation, fine. Now you compete with us, or if it's not in the private sector, in the public sector, it's the private sector, now you're supposed to compete with us on merit. Whereas the Savarnas have had thousands and thousands of years of intergenerational transfer of wealth, land, asset, income earning asset, education, how to get education, how to study, how to be disciplined. This is all cultural knowledge which is passed on. And all that is passed on to the untouchables and the ex-slave is basically nothing. In addition, you have humiliation, you have psychological problems. It is a well-known social psychological phenomena that minority communities, like the Dalits, like the Muslims, any country, suffer from victim mentality. And they are unable to trust each other. They are unable to form groups as effectively as the upper caste are. So it is a problem of the community. And this is a historic baggage, psychological baggage of trauma, humiliation, guilt, lack of identity and dignity which was being talked about. Because if I look at my grandfather's generation, I mean, they just survived barely by just keeping their head above the water. So my point is, and I think I'm taking a lot of time, I'm sure, is that there is a lot to talk about, and there are a lot of arguments. Why reparations? There is a harm argument, there is the inheritance argument, there is a spiritual argument, and a lot of these arguments have been, and there is philosophical argument given in the 16th century about clearly about why reparation is legally, morally justified. But I think I'm going to stop here because I'm just, you had a long day, and also, you know, I can go on and on for hours. So, I mean, the arguments are very simple, that you can compensate someone, right? But compensation is very different. I lose something because someone hurts me, or the government takes my land or my forest, so the government compensates me, and I go to another piece of land and I start farming. So that's some kind of compensation. Restitution is you're restored to the original state. Someone steals my bike, returns my bike without apology or without anything. And I feel but suppose I'm being harmed. So a girl is there, her parents are killed. Her entire life changes because of that. Now you punish the killers, but have you changed her life? Has she been compensated for the loss of parents, the love, the attention, the care, the education she would have got, and everything? Because now she is either an orphan or she is living with her relatives who don't care about her. What about that compensation? So she needs some kind of monetary compensation. She needs state support. She needs other kind of psychological counseling and other services. And this is a package. And an apology maybe from the perpetrators, where she feels, okay, fine. I feel some sense of reparation. So reparation involves a larger set of measures. You need an apology that, yes, we as a group, as an upper caste group or as a powerful class group, say in Europe it was aristocracy, we apologize. We accept that we harmed you. We accept this historical exclusion, discrimination, violence. We accept it happened. There is no acceptance, because it's ordained by God and all that crap. So it needs acceptance and apology first, which is humanistic, psychological, spiritual in that sense. And then you think about compensation. Should there be land distribution? Should there be like an education fund for children that you deposit 10 lakh rupees, 20 lakh rupees in the account of people, and their children can use them when they need that money, which is one of the suggestions being put forth by academics in America for the African American descendants of slave trade, which are called baby bonds. And there are many such, but first, even to go on that path, there has to be an acknowledgement that harm has been done. The harm argument says that a community was harmed for 2,000 years. If that harm has happened, then it has a down the stream impact on their descendants. You cannot expect that that harm of 2,000 years will have no impact on their children and children's children. And they need to be compensated for the harm done to their ancestors. That is the harm argument. They may not be there, but the bad effect of that harm is passed on to their subsequent generations. So that is the harm argument. The inheritance argument is that they also inherit the trauma. They also inherit the loss of their ancestors, which our generation is trying to make up. And we see public sector job as the only way out. Some of the next generation are managing to get private sector jobs. But there is no reservation in private sector, and it is growing. Of the total jobs in the country, only 6% jobs are in public sector, 6%. And that is this fight we are talking about in reservation. And the rest is all open, which we don't talk about, or the reservation in private sector. So that is a different fight, but I think we need to start thinking about what about the harm done to our ancestors for 2,500 years and the compensation for that. I'll stop here, and hopefully I'm invited again and I can talk more about this in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I would request Shri Lalit Khobragade to please felicitate Dr. Amit Thorat. Thank you, sir. Our second speaker for the session is not available online, but the speaker for session 1, Dr. Sanjay Tabade, is there online. And sir, if you can hear me, I request you to please talk. Sir, you are mute. Please unmute yourself. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. आवाज येतोय. Yes, sir. Please बोला.
हां, जय भीम. मी फेडरेशन फॉर सोशल जस्टिस आणि बार्टी यांनी आणि आपण जी कॉन्फरन्स घेतली आणि मला या ठिकाणी बोलवलं त्याबद्दल मी सर्व संयोजकांचे खूप मनापासून आभार मानतो. मला जो विषय माझ्यासमोर आहे तो आहे आदिवासींच्या रिझर्वेशनच्या संदर्भातले जे इश्यूज आहेत, ओल्ड इश्यूज आणि इमर्जिंग इश्यूज असे ज्याला आपण म्हणता येईल, त्याबद्दल मी थोडी मांडणी करणार आहे. ट्रायबल रिझर्वेशनच्या संदर्भात चर्चा करताना महाराष्ट्रामध्ये सुमारे 45 आदिवासी जमाती आहेत आणि या 45 आदिवासी जमातींमध्ये काही आदिवासी जमाती ह्या मोर प्रिमिटिव्ह काइंड आहेत. उदाहरणार्थ कातकरी सारख्या ज्या जमाती आहेत, कोरकू आहेत, तर असं एक थोडंसं क्लासिफिकेशन आपल्याला ट्रायबल महाराष्ट्रातल्या आदिवासी जमातींमध्ये दिसतं. आणि विशेषतः आरक्षणाच्या संदर्भात विचार करताना गेल्या 70 वर्षातली, म्हणजे संविधान आल्यानंतर गेल्या 70 वर्षातली काय परिस्थिती राहिली आदिवासींच्या संदर्भामध्ये आणि आत्ताचे नेमके काय प्रॉब्लेम्स आहेत आणि त्याचे सोल्युशन्स काय असू शकतात याबद्दल आपल्याला थोडंसं चर्चा या ठिकाणी करता येईल. आदिवासींमध्ये सुमारे साधारणतः 2 दशकांपासून एका खऱ्या अर्थानं एक नवीन मध्यमवर्ग तयार व्हायला लागला. शेड्यूल कास्टच्या तुलनेमध्ये शेड्यूल ट्राईब मधलं हा जो एक नवीन मध्यमवर्ग तयार होण्याची जी प्रक्रिया आहे ती त्या दृष्टीने विचार करता तशी उशिरा झाली असं म्हणता येईल. आणि या मुद्द्याच्या संदर्भात म्हणजे वाय शेड्यूल ट्राईब्स आर लॅगिंग बिहाइंड शेड्यूल कास्ट या संदर्भाचं व्हर्जिनियस खाका म्हणून जे विचारवंत आहेत, अभ्यासक आहेत, त्यांनी याची सविस्तर मांडणी केलेली की वाय शेड्यूल ट्राईब्स आर लॅगिंग बिहाइंड शेड्यूल कास्ट. त्याची वेगवेगळी जॉग्राफिकल आयसोलेशन, कल्चरल वेगळेपण आणि एकूण लार्जर सोसायटीचा जो भाग शेड्यूल कास्ट समाज राहिला त्याप्रमाणे शेड्यूल ट्राईब हा एकूण लार्जर सोसायटीचा भाग राहिला नाही. तो लार्जर सोसायटीच्या पासून अलिप्त अशा भूभागात राहिला आणि त्याच्यामुळे सुद्धा ही कारणं आहेत की त्याच्यामुळे शेड्यूल ट्राईब हे लॅग करतात ॲज कम्पेअर्ड टू शेड्यूल कास्ट. तर ही जी शेड्यूल कास्टच्या संदर्भातले इतर जे प्रॉब्लेम्स आहेत आरक्षणाचे ते सुद्धा त्याच्यामध्ये शेड्यूल ट्राईबचे जे प्रॉब्लेम्स आहेत त्याच्यामध्ये आपल्याला असं दिसतं की आत्ता महाराष्ट्रातला जो आदिवासी मध्यम वर्ग आहे आणि किंवा नवा सुशिक्षित होणारा आदिवासी, तर त्याच्यामध्ये प्रॉब्लेम असा दिसतोय की महाराष्ट्रामध्ये आदिवासी जमातीचे सर्टिफिकेट्स घेऊन म्हणजे आदिवासी जमातीचे दाखले घेऊन घेण्याचं प्रमाण म्हणजे बोगस लोक जे आहेत, म्हणजे जे खऱ्या अर्थानं कॉन्स्टिट्युशनल शेड्यूल मध्ये नाहीत, स्टेटचं जो शेड्यूल आहे त्याच्यामध्ये शेड्यूल ट्राईबच्या लिस्टमध्ये नाहीत, तरी सुद्धा त्या अनुसूचित त्या जाती आहेत आणि त्या जाती आहेत आणि त्या जाती केवळ नामसदृश्याचा फायदा घेऊन, म्हणजे उदाहरणार्थ महादेव कोळी ही महाराष्ट्रातली अनुसूचित जमात आहे, परंतु नुसते कोळी जे आहेत ते ओबीसी मध्ये येतात. परंतु काही या जातींनी, बिगर आदिवासी जातींनी नाम साधर्म्याचा फायदा घेऊन आदिवासींच्या ज्या हक्काच्या जागा आहेत त्या मोठ्या प्रमाणामध्ये त्यांनी मिळवल्या. याच्यामुळे असं झालं की फार मोठ्या प्रमाणामध्ये खरा आदिवासी ज्या जमाती आहेत महाराष्ट्रातल्या त्यांचे आरक्षणाचे हक्क फार मध्ये पुण्यामधल्या बीजे मेडिकल कॉलेजमध्ये 200 जागा एकूण सीट्स होत्या बीजे मेडिकल कॉलेजमध्ये MBBSच्या. त्या 200 जागांमध्ये 14 जागा ह्या शेड्यूल ट्राईबला आलेल्या होत्या, परंतु त्या 14 पैकी 12 जागांवर हे अनुसूचित जमातीचे खरे नसलेले इतर जातींचे असणारी विद्यार्थी हे बीजे मेडिकल कॉलेजमध्ये MBBSचा अभ्यास घेत होते. म्हणजे फक्त जे ओरिजिनल आदिवासी आहेत ज्यांचं नाव शेड्यूल मध्ये आहे शेड्यूल ट्राईबच्या, त्यांच्यापैकी फक्त 2 विद्यार्थी हे शेड्यूल ट्राईब मधनं प्रवेश घेऊ शकले होते. मोर ऑरलेस ही परिस्थिती नंतर बदलत गेली. 1996 मध्ये माधुरी पाटील वर्सेस स्टेट ऑफ महाराष्ट्र
I think there is bad internet connection. So we would proceed to the next session. So here we conclude the scientific sessions and let us begin the concluding ceremony for this conference. For the same, I would request Padma Shri Dr. Sukhdev Thorat to please come on the stage. Along with him, our guests were Honorable Dhammajyoti Gajbhye. Due to his work schedule, he could not make for the concluding ceremony. But on behalf of Federation of Organization for Social Justice, Secularism and Democracy, I would like to acknowledge Sir's efforts and support. His unprecedented support and cooperation has actually made this conference happen. Thank you, sir, so much. Along with him, Mr. Rahul Parulkar was also was going to join us for the concluding ceremony, but due to his familial issues, he could not. So now I would request Padma Shri Dr. Sukhdev Thorat to please come up on the stage. Along with him, I would request Dr. Trilok Hazare and Professor Gautam Kamble to join us for the concluding ceremony. I would request Dr. Sukhdev Thorat to please give the concluding speech.
जवळजवळ 2.5 घंटे ते 3 घंटे उशिरा प्रोग्राम सुरू झाला आणि इंटरनेटचे प्रॉब्लेम हे सर्व असूनही मला असं वाटते की या एक दिवसाच्या चर्चासत्रामध्ये जे मेन स्पीकर होते त्या मेन स्पीकरला आपण ऐकू शकलो. शेड्यूल कास्ट, शेड्यूल ट्राईब आणि ओबीसीच्या रिझर्वेशनच्या प्रश्नावर, दलित ख्रिश्चन दलित मुस्लिमच्या प्रश्नावर देशपांडेंचं फार चांगलं भाषण झालं, सतीश देशपांडेंचं. त्यानंतर रिलिजियस मायनॉरिटीजवर 2 स्पीकरनी त्यांची मतं व्यक्त केली. EWS रिझर्वेशनवर मोहन गोपालचं अप्रतिम भाषण झालं, ज्यांनी घटनेच्या पूर्वी आणि घटनेमध्ये काय तरतुदी आहेत याविषयीची संपूर्ण चर्चा केली. त्यानंतर महिलांच्या प्रश्नावर सुभाषिनी अली आणि विमल थोरात यांनी योग्य अशी जे प्रश्न आहेत सध्याचे त्यांच्या रिझर्वेशनच्या बाबतीत आणि डिस्क्रिमिनेशनच्या बाबतीत ते मांडलेत. आणि शेवटी पॉलिसीच्या संदर्भामध्ये अनुराग भास्कर प्रायव्हेट सेक्टर इन रिझर्वेशन बोलणार होते, पण त्यांचा मेसेज आला की ही इज बिझी विथ द चीफ जस्टिस ऑफ इंडिया, सो वी कांट हेल्प हिम टू गेट हिअर. अमित थोरातांनी एक अल्टरनेटिव्ह पॉलिसीची मांडणी केली की रिझर्वेशन बरोबर शेड्यूल कास्टला पर्टिक्युलरली नुकसान भरपाई मिळाली पाहिजे. तर मला असं वाटते एकूण हे सर्व अडथळे असतानासुद्धा मुख्य मुद्द्यावर व्यवस्थित चर्चा झाली आणि त्याचा सर्वांना मला असं वाटते फायदा मिळाला. शेड्यूल कास्ट, शेड्यूल ट्राईब आणि ओबीसीच्या प्रश्नावर त्यांचे जे ग्रुप स्पेसिफिक प्रॉब्लेम्स आहेत ते प्रॉब्लेम बरेचसे आपल्यासमोर आलेत. दलितांचे शेड्यूल कास्टचे जे अनटचेबिलिटीशी संबंधित डिस्क्रिमिनेशन आहे आणि बॅकलॉग कसा कायम राहतो, सीट कशा भरल्या जात नाहीत, रमा यांनी हे सर्व आपल्यासमोर आणून मांडलं. अनटचेबिलिटी आणि ॲट्रॉसिटी अजून कशा कायम आहेत. शेड्यूल ट्राईबचे प्रश्न मांडण्यात आलेत, वेळ मिळाला नाही त्यांना. ओबीसीच्या रिझर्वेशनवर बरेचसे नवीन मुद्दे आलेत की त्यांची पॉप्युलेशन जास्त असताना त्यांना अंडर रिप्रेझेंट कसं काय मिळतं. मायनॉरिटीजच्या प्रश्नावर मुद्दे मांडण्यात आलेत. दलित ख्रिश्चन दलित मुस्लिमच्या प्रश्नासंबंधी सरकारने जी भूमिका घेतली की दलित ख्रिश्चन आणि दलित मुस्लिम हे या धर्मामध्ये कन्वर्ट झालेल्या ज्या धर्मामध्ये समतेची भाषा आहे आणि अनटचेबिलिटी नाही, त्यामुळे दे डोंट डिझर्व रिझर्वेशन. सेंट्रल गव्हर्नमेंटनी सुप्रीम कोर्टामध्ये अशी आर्ग्युमेंट केली. त्याच पद्धतीनं रिलिजियस मायनॉरिटीज जे आहेत, विशेषतः मुस्लिम आणि ख्रिश्चन यांना, मुस्लिमना विशेषतः रिझर्वेशनची गरज नाही, कारण का ते लार्जर हिंदुझमचा पार्ट नाही आणि घटनेमध्ये प्रोव्हिजन नाही. परंतु घटनेमध्ये दुसरीसुद्धा प्रोव्हिजन आहे. द घटना डिबार डिस्क्रिमिनेशन इरेस्पेक्टिव्ह ऑफ रिलिजन, कास्ट, इथनिसिटी, रेस, कलर. आणि जे रिलिजियस ग्रुपचं किंवा जे ग्रुप शेड्यूल कास्ट शेड्यूल ट्राईब हे ख्रिश्चॅनिटीमध्ये आणि इस्लाममध्ये कन्वर्ट झाले असेल आणि त्यांचं डिस्क्रिमिनेशन जर कायम असेल तर हे अनिवार्य आहे सरकारला की काहीतरी पॉलिसी घेतली पाहिजे. त्यांना लिगल प्रोटेक्शन असलं पाहिजे अगेन्स्ट डिस्क्रिमिनेशनच्या विरोधामध्ये. डिस्क्रिमिनेशनमुळे त्यांना जर रिप्रेझेंटेशन मिळत नसेल तर त्यांना पॉलिसी त्यांच्याकरता बनवली पाहिजे. नॉट एक्झॅक्टली रिझर्वेशन टाईप बट पॉलिसी विच विल गिव्ह देम ड्यू रिप्रेझेंटेशन. पण सरकार जे आहे उघडपणे अनेक अशा मुद्द्यावर विरोधाभासी विचार व्यक्त करतं. काही ठिकाणी हे सुद्धा बोललं जातं त्याच आर्ग्युमेंटमध्ये की त्यांचं डिस्क्रिमिनेशन होत नाही. सफिशियंट एव्हिडन्स आहे की दलित ख्रिश्चनचं डिस्क्रिमिनेशन होतं, चर्चमध्ये सुद्धा होतं आणि ॲज ए पार्ट ऑफ द हिंदू सोसायटीसुद्धा होतं. जे शेड्यूल कास्ट किंवा अनटचेबल्स इस्लाममध्ये कन्वर्ट झाले, मला असं वाटते 1000 वर्षापूर्वी, पण अजूनही ती परंपरा आहे. महमूद पाशांनी फार व्यवस्थितशीरपणे मांडलं की इस्लाममध्ये कास्ट सिस्टीम आणि हायरार्की कशी आहे आणि कसं डिस्क्रिमिनेशन होतं वेगवेगळ्या प्रकारे, हे सुद्धा त्यांनी बाहेर मांडलेलं आहे. तर ही भारतीय सोसायटी जी डायव्हर्सिफाईड अँड सेग्रिगेटेड अँड एक्सक्लुडेड अँड आयसोलेटेड आहे फ्रॉम डिफरंट ग्रुप. ह्याच्यामध्ये सर्वांना योग्य असं रिप्रेझेंटेशन मिळणं हे फार आवश्यक आहे आणि त्याच्याकरता पॉलिसीज बनवलेल्या पाहिजेत. ग्रुप स्पेसिफिक पॉलिसी बनवायच्या, ज्या ग्रुपचे जसे प्रॉब्लेम आहे तशात पॉलिसी ग्रुप स्पेसिफिक बनवाव्यात. परंतु ह्या आर्ग्युमेंट देणं की त्यांचं डिस्क्रिमिनेशन होत नाही, त्यांच्या धर्मामध्ये समानतेचं प्रिन्सिपल आहे, तिथे अनटचेबिलिटी नाही, ह्या आर्ग्युमेंटनी फारसा काही उपयोग होत नाही. मला आठवते KR नारायणींनी एकदा फार अत्यंत सुंदर असं वाक्य वापरलं की भारतीय ब्युरोक्रेसी आणि भारतीय पॉलिटिक्स आणि भारतीय इकॉनॉमी it should reflect the society. If it is diversified, the diversification should reflect in actual government. त्यांनी शब्द वापरला होता की it should be a mirror image of government, should be a mirror image of society. जसं आरशामध्ये आपल्याला आपलं प्रतिबिंब दिसतं तसं सोसायटीचं प्रतिबिंब शासनामध्ये, लेजिस्लेचरमध्ये, इकॉनॉमीमध्ये आणि ब्युरोक्रेसीमध्ये हे दिसायला हवं. तर मला असं वाटते आजच्या याच्यामधून आपल्याला महत्त्वाचे लेसन्स मिळालेले आहेत. पॉलिसीच्या बाबतीत अनुराग भास्कर जे PhD करत आहेत त्याच्यावर त्यांची मूळ आर्ग्युमेंट अशी आहे की कॉन्स्टिट्युशनली अँड लिगली रिझर्वेशनवर काही बंदी नाही आहे. रिझर्वेशन दिला जाऊ शकतो कॉन्स्टिट्युशनली प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये. आर्टिकल 16(5) मला असं वाटतं ऑलरेडी प्रायव्हेट एज्युकेशन इन्स्टिट्यूशन अनएडेड एज्युकेशनमध्ये रिझर्वेशन मान्य केलेलं आहे आणि EWS ग्रुपला ते रिझर्वेशन दिलेलं आहे. पण शेड्यूल कास्ट शेड्यूल ट्राईब करता कायदा करून द्यावं लागलं, पण सरकारनं 2008 पासून अजून कायदा केला नाही. सो कॉन्स्टिट्युशनली सुद्धा रिझर्वेशन प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये दिलं जाऊ शकते. आणि डिस्क्रिमिनेशन खऱ्या अर्थाने सर्वात मोठं हे प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्येच आहे, पब्लिक सेक्टरमध्ये कमी असतं. तर तिथे रिझर्वेशन असायला पाहिजे. इतर कंट्रीमध्ये आहे, अमेरिकेमध्ये, नॉर्दर्न आयर्लंडमध्ये, ऑस्ट्रेलिया, न्यूझीलंड, इथे सर्व प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये, जपान प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये रिझर्वेशन आहे, कारण का प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये रिझर्वेशन आहे. बाबासाहेबांनी प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरमध्ये रिझर्वेशनची मागणी केली होती, पण ती स्ट्रॅटेजी म्हणून पब्लिक सेक्टरमध्ये त्यांनी ती आणली. तर प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरचं रिझर्वेशन आज आणायला पाहिजे. आणि जेव्हा प्रायव्हेटायझेशन ऑफ इकॉनॉमी हे मोठ्या प्रमाणावर होत आहे, पब्लिक सेक्टर अंडरटेकिंग आर प्रायव्हेटाइज, health sector which is with the government is privatized, insurance sector which is with the government is privatized, and many other sectors are being privatized. So the space for reservation in public sector is getting reduced, narrower and narrower. छोट्याशा केकमध्ये एक तुकडा दलितांना आणि आदिवासींना आणि OBCंना मिळतो. दुसरा महत्त्वाचा मुद्दा जो अमित थोरातनी मांडला, त्यांनी जरा ते अकॅडमिक लेवलवर ठेवलं आर्ग्युमेंट, पण साध्या भाषेमध्ये ती जर आर्ग्युमेंट सांगायची असेल तर ती अशी की मला थोडंसं दीक्षा आणि मोहन गोपालनी जी आर्ग्युमेंट केली की कॉन्स्टिट्युशनल प्रोव्हिजन इज फॉर द रिप्रेझेंटेशन करता रिझर्वेशनची गरज आहे. मला असं वाटते त्याच्या पुढे गेलं पाहिजे. बाबासाहेब त्याच्या पुढे गेलेले आहेत की पब्लिक सेक्टरमध्ये जॉबमध्ये जे रिझर्वेशन पाहिजे असेल तर तुमच्याजवळ कॅपेबिलिटी असली पाहिजे ना, एज्युकेशनची कॅपेबिलिटी असली पाहिजे. एज्युकेशन घेण्याकरता तुम्हाला एक तर स्वस्त शाळा कॉलेजेस असायला पाहिजे किंवा तुमची आर्थिक स्थिती चांगली असायला पाहिजे. तर बाबासाहेबांनी रिझर्वेशन बरोबर हा आग्रह धरलेला आहे स्टेट अँड मायनॉरिटीमध्ये इतर ठिकाणी की एज्युकेशनल राईट शेड्यूकांना नाकारले, प्रॉपर्टीचा राईट नाकारला, वेल्थचा राईट नाकारला, तर जिथपर्यंत त्यांना वेल्थ आणि प्रॉपर्टी दिल्या जाणार नाही आणि एज्युकेशन करता फंड गोळा करून त्यांच्या एज्युकेशन डेव्हलपमेंटची गॅरंटी देण्यात जाणार नाही, तिथपर्यंत इक्वल अपॉर्च्युनिटीतून काय उपयोग आहे. इक्वल अपॉर्च्युनिटीचं प्रिन्सिपल दोन्ही बाजूला कट करतं बरं का. तर इक्वल अपॉर्च्युनिटी देण्याकरता इकॉनॉमिक इम्पॉवरमेंट, गिविंग देम लँड, गिविंग देम एंटरप्रिन्योरशिप, गिविंग देम एज्युकेशन अँड फंड फॉर एज्युकेशन, हे इकॉनॉमिक इम्पॉवरमेंट असेल तर रिझर्वेशनमध्ये अधिक इफेक्टिव्हली भाग होईल. त्यामुळे बऱ्याचशा सबकास्ट रिझर्वेशन का मागत आहेत की ते इकॉनॉमीला इतक्या मागं आहेत की त्यामुळे रिझर्वेशनचा सुद्धा फायदा घेऊ शकत नाहीत. ते उदाहरणार्थ नॉमॅडिक ट्राईब आणि यांना रिझर्वेशन देऊन इलिजिबल कॅन्डिडेट्स नाही आहेत, शिकलेलेच नाही आहेत, तर कसे काय रिझर्वेशनमध्ये येणार. म्हणून महत्त्वाचा मुद्दा जो मी मांडतोय तो असा की इकॉनॉमिक अँड एज्युकेशन इम्पॉवरमेंट इज ऑल्सो नेसेसरी. आणि इकॉनॉमिक एज्युकेशन इम्पॉवरमेंटची सुद्धा पॉलिसी बाबासाहेबांनी मागितली ना, जे सुरू आहे. लँड डिस्ट्रीब्युशन आहे महाराष्ट्रामध्ये, दादासाहेब गायकवाडची स्कीम आहे लँड डिस्ट्रीब्युशनची. एंटरप्रिन्युअरशिप डेव्हलपमेंट करण्याकरता क्रेडिट फॅसिलिटी अँड प्रोक्युरमेंटची पॉलिसी आहे. एज्युकेशन करता स्कॉलरशिप आहेत. पण त्याचं जस्टिफिकेशन जे आहे, त्या जस्टिफिकेशनचे आर्ग्युमेंट अमित थोरात देत होते की इतर देशामध्ये कंपन्सेशन किंवा ज्याला रिपरेशन आपण म्हणतो त्याचा साधा अर्थ असा आहे की दलितांचे प्रॉपर्टीचे अधिकार नाकारले, एज्युकेशनचे अधिकार नाकारले, धंदा करण्याचा अधिकार नाकारला किंवा उच्च जातीच्या नोकऱ्यांमध्ये नोकऱ्यांचा अधिकार नाकारला. अनटचेबिलिटीमध्ये अनेक जॉब तुम्हाला करता येत नाही. हे तुम्ही नाकारल्यामुळे त्याच्याजवळ आज हायलँडलेसनेस, इलिटरसी हे आपल्याला पाहायला मिळतं. पण तो सर्वात महत्त्वाचा मुद्दा तो आहे की दी दलित्स आर लँडलेस, more illiterate, more powerless, because high caste are literate. High caste have more land, high caste have more entrepreneurship. So the Dalit suffer at the cost of high caste. आणि हे मनुस्मृतीमध्ये अनेक दोह्यामध्ये लिहिलेलं आहे की the only job of untouchable Shudra is to serve the Brahmin. If they don't serve, there won't be a development of theirs. दलितांनी आपल्या प्रगतीकरता ब्राह्मणांची सेवा करावी. दलितांनी आपल्या स्वतःच्या प्रगतीकरता संपत्तीचे अक्युमुलेट करू नये. दलितांनी आपल्या प्रगतीकरता शिक्षण घेऊ नये. याच्यापेक्षा इंजिव्हिनिटी आणि चालाखी कोणत्या स्कॉलरशिपची असू शकते का? कोणत्या विद्वानाची असू शकते का? तर म्हणजे हेही होऊ शकतं ना की आम्हाला जास्त अधिकार, पण तुमचे अधिकार आम्ही थांबवत नाही. आम्हाला लँडचा अधिकार असला पाहिजे, आम्हाला शिक्षणाचा अधिकार असला पाहिजे, पण तुम्ही शिक्षण घेऊ शकता. तसं नाही आहे. आम्हाला शिक्षणाचा अधिकार, जमिनीचे अधिकार, उद्योगधंद्याचा अधिकार, रिलिजियस अधिकार, पण तुम्हाला तो नाही आहे. सो आय बिकेम वेल ऑफ ॲट युअर कॉस्ट. तेथे प्रिन्सिपल ऑफ कम्पन्सेशन रिपरेशन येतं की तुम्ही मला हानी पोहोचवली त्याची परतफेड करा. साध्या मराठी भाषेत सांगायचं म्हणजे, आणि ती परतफेड करणं म्हणजे पॉलिसी कम्पन्सेशनची रिप्रेशनची पॉलिसी आहे. जस्टिफिकेशन आहे त्याच्यामध्ये. तुमच्या गाडीला कोणी धक्का मारला तर तुम्ही म्हणता त्याचे पैसे द्या मला, किंवा इन्शुरन्स कंपनी तुम्हाला देते. इथे तर 2500 वर्षे तुम्हाला तुमच्या अधिकारापासून मुक्त हे दूर ठेवलेलं आहे, तर त्याची नुकसान भरपाई झाली पाहिजे ना. यू बिकेम रिच ॲट अवर कॉस्ट. ब्राह्मणांना एज्युकेशन असल्यामुळे जेव्हा मोगलांच्या काळामध्ये, ब्रिटिशांच्या काळामध्ये सरकारी नोकऱ्या मिळाल्या तर ते एज्युकेटेड असल्यामुळे ते नोकरीमध्ये गेले. दलितांना नोकऱ्या नाही मिळाल्या. मुस्लिम तयार होते पण शिक्षण नव्हतं. सो द ब्राह्मीन बेनिफिटेड ॲट द कॉस्ट ऑफ द डिनायल ऑफ राईट टू एज्युकेशन टू अनटचेबल. सो समबडी दे हॅव टू रिपे इट. दॅट इज द आर्ग्युमेंट, लिगल अँड मॉरल आर्ग्युमेंट ऑफ कम्पन्सेशन. आणि बाबासाहेबांनी तशी ती आर्ग्युमेंट केली होती, पण त्या भाषेमध्ये नाही केली, कारण का रिपरेशन कम्पन्सेशनचा पॉलिसी फार नंतर आली. तर आजच्या घडीला मला असं वाटतं की अनटचेबलला जे अधिकार सर्व नाकारले त्याचं कम्पन्सेशन म्हणून सरकारने जमीन वाटपाचं काम, उद्योगधंदे देण्याचं काम, शिक्षणाच्या मोठमोठ्या शिक्षणाकरता स्कॉलरशिप देण्याचं काम, ज्याचे उदाहरण अमित थोरांनी दिलेत आता की कम्पन्सेशनमधून स्कॉलरशिप दिल्या जात आहेत ब्लॅकला, ते जस्टिफायबल आपण केलं पाहिजे. उपकार नव्हे, सिम्पथी नव्हे, दयाभाव नव्हे, तुम्ही केलेल्या अन्यायाचं रिपेमेंट म्हणून तुम्हाला ते करावं लागेल. ही जर आर्ग्युमेंट केली तर मग हे व्यवस्थेशीर आपण जस्टिफाय करू शकतो आपल्या ह्या मागणीला. माफीचा भाग तर आहेच आहे. स्लेवरी आली म्हणून पोपनं माफी मागितली, पण इथे शंकराचार्य थोडी माफी मागत आहेत की अनटचेबिलिटी आम्ही तुमच्यावर 2000 वर्ष लागू केली तर अजून माफी नाही. पश्चाताप, दुःख, वेदना, रिपेंटन्स हे नाही आहे, उलट सपोर्ट आहे, उलट जस्टिफिकेशन आहे. अलीकडे तर आता मनुस्मृतीची भाषा बोलल्या जाते, समतेच्या ऐवजी समरसतेची भाषा बोलल्या जाते. तर हा जो कॉन्सेप्ट आहे पॉलिसीचा जो आहे कम्पन्सेशन रिपेरेशनची जी पॉलिसी आहे ही आता याचा आपण वापर आणि हे केला पाहिजे की यू आर बेटर ऑफ बिकॉज वी आर वर्स ऑफ. तुम्ही लिटरेट आहात, तुम्हाला जॉब मिळतो बिकॉज वी आर इलिटरेट अँड इट इज यू हू हॅव मेक अस इलिटरेट आणि ते तुम्हाला भरून द्यावं लागेल. तर मला असं वाटते फार चांगली चर्चा काही मुद्द्यावर आली. हा मुद्दा थोडा अधिक मला स्पष्ट करायचा होता की रिझर्वेशनची तर पॉलिसी माहीत आहे आपला, ती प्रायव्हेट सेक्टरकडे एक्सटेंड करावी, परंतु कम्पन्सेशन ह्याच्यावर सुद्धा आपण आर्ग्युमेंट केली पाहिजे. एका अर्थाने घटनेमध्ये ही कॉन्स्टिट्युशनमध्ये ही मागणी केली होती, बाबासाहेबांची डोक्यामध्ये होतं. तर एक बाबासाहेबांच्या शेजारी राहत होते सरदार नागप्पा, आंध्र प्रदेशाचे काँग्रेसचे ते मेंबर होते म्हणजे कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन असेंब्लीमध्ये. तर बाबासाहेबांवर इंटरॅक्शन असल्यामुळे बाबासाहेबचे विचार त्यांना समजत होते. तर त्यांनी काँग्रेसच्या वतीनं कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन असेंब्लीमध्ये जेव्हा रिझर्वेशनचं बिल आलं त्यावेळेस ही मागणी केली. कोणीतरी म्हणालं तुम्हाला रिझर्वेशन कुठपर्यंत पाहिजे, कशाला हवं आहे, मुस्लिमांचं काढून घेतलं, ख्रिश्चनांचं काढून घेतलं, शेड्यूल कास्टने सुद्धा सॅक्रिफाय करावा वगैरे वगैरे. त्यावेळेस नागप्पा बोलले, ते असं म्हणाले की तुम्ही आम्हाला जमिनीचा आणि उद्योगधंद्याचा आणि शिक्षणाचा अधिकार नाकारला आहे. याचा एका अर्थानं मोबदला म्हणून ते म्हणाले 10 एकर इरिगेटेड लँड किंवा 20 एकर ड्राय लँड द्या एका कुटुंबाला, त्याच्यानंतर मिलिटरीमध्ये पोलीसमध्ये नोकऱ्या द्या आणि त्याच्यानंतर पहिल्या वर्गापासून ते युनिव्हर्सिटीपर्यंत फ्री शिक्षण द्या आणि आमचं रिझर्वेशन काढून घ्या, आम्हाला नको आहे रिझर्वेशन. त्यावेळेस एक ब्राह्मीण गृहस्थ बसला होता कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन असेंब्लीमध्ये, तो म्हणाला असं जर असेल 10 एकर मला म्हणतात तर मी दलित बनायला तयार आहे. तर त्यावेळेस तो फार हजर जबाबी होता, म्हणा बिलकुल तुम्ही दलित व्हा पण पहिले स्कॅव्हेंजर बना, मॅन्युअल स्कॅव्हेंजिंग करा. तर जरी हा कॉम्पन्सेशनचा आणि रिप्रेशनचा कॉन्सेप्ट डेव्हलप झाला नव्हता तरी ही संकल्पना काही लोकांच्या डोक्यामध्ये होती आणि ती नागप्पांनी बरोबर मांडली, हेरली. ते 2-2 वेळा म्हणाले. ते बाबासाहेबांचे तेच होतं, बाबासाहेब बोललेले आहेत त्या भाषेमध्ये. पण आता जे नवीन थिअरी येत आहे, लिटरेचर येत आहे, तर हे जे विचार अल्टरनेटिव्ह पॉलिसी आहे, ह्या अल्टरनेटिव्ह पॉलिसी आपण आता मांडल्या पाहिजेत आणि मागणी केली पाहिजे हक्काने. एक आर्ग्युमेंट होत राहते की तरुण हायकाचे लोक म्हणतात की आमची थोडी आम्हाला थोडी बदनाम करता तुम्ही, आमच्या नातेवाईकांनी आमच्या पूर्वजांनी केलं, आम्ही थोडी केलं. ते तसं नाही आहे. पूर्वजांनी जमिनी आपल्याकडे घेतल्या, शिक्षण आपल्याकडे घेतलं, उद्योगधंदे आपल्याकडे घेतलं आणि फ्रॉम जनरेशन टू जनरेशन तो अधिकार तुम्हाला दिला, दलितांना नाकारला. यू आर द बेनिफिशियरी ऑफ दोज इंटरजनरेशन ट्रान्सफर ऑफ लँड, पॉवर, इकॉनॉमिक पॉवर, social power and education. You benefited from those privileges. So you have also to pay it. मी माझ्या त्या एका भाषणामध्ये लेखामध्ये म्हटलं दिस इज अ सोशल डेट, कर्ज आहे उच्च जातींनी दलितांना पे करावं. मला असं वाटते हजारे आपण इथे थांबावं आता. थँक्यू सिटिंग हिअर.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I request Professor Gautam Kamble to please propose vote of thanks.
या दिवसभराच्या परिषदेचं एक निष्कर्ष म्हणून किंवा एक ज्याला आपण फलित म्हणून, नागपूर हे एक मोठं शहर आहे. या शहरामध्ये परिवर्तन जर आपल्याला करायचं असेल, राजकीय परिवर्तन म्हणून आपण सुरुवातीला, तर त्यासंबंधी एका रॅलीचं आयोजन आपण जानेवारी महिन्यात करू. तर मला असं वाटतं की याला तुमची संमती असेल आणि सहकार्य पण असेल. आभार व्यक्त करण्यापूर्वी मी जे पडद्यामागचे जे हिरो असतात, ज्यांनी अपार श्रम केलेला आहे आजच्या दिवशी, तर त्यांचा आदरणीय थोरात सरांच्या हस्ते एक छोटासा सत्कार करू इच्छितो. बार्टीचे तुषार सूर्यवंशी, तुषार नाही, तर त्यापूर्वी शीतल गडलिंग, शीतल गडलिंग, दुसरे हृदय गोडबोले. हां, तुम्ही आला, ठीक आहे. तुषार सूर्यवंशी हे चांगले कीर्तनकार आहेत. हां, सगळ्यांना माहिती आहे. त्यानंतर आज ही संपूर्ण परिषद आपल्या खांद्यावर ज्यांनी घेतली आणि फार चांगलं सूत्रसंचालन केलं त्या डॉक्टर शिल्पा हजारे मॅडम. हे जे ऑनलाईन प्रेझेंटेशन झालं त्याचं सर्वांसोबत कम्युनिकेशन केलं आणि आपल्यापर्यंत इतक्या प्रतिकूल स्थितीमध्ये ते प्रेझेंटेशन आपल्यासमोर सादर केलं, तर त्यासाठी जे काही कष्ट घेतले त्या प्राध्यापका विद्या चोरपगार मॅम. आणि शब्दसुमनाने मी त्यांचा सत्कार करतो. शुद्धोधन, विनीत हे दोघेही पुण्यावरून आले या परिषदेसाठी आणि पवन मुंबईवरून आले 3 दिवसापूर्वी. त्यांचंही मी आभार व्यक्त करतो. ठीक आहे, शुद्धोधन, विनीत आणि पवन तिघही या. स्वप्नील पण, स्वप्नील नागपूरचा आहे. तर सर्वप्रथम मी आपल्या सगळ्यांचे आभार व्यक्त करतो. म्हणजे सकाळी 10 वाजतापासून आपण आलात, सभागृहामध्ये उपस्थित राहिलात. खरं म्हणजे आपले कष्ट सगळ्यात मोठे आहेत आणि त्यामुळे आपल्या सगळ्यांचे, सभागृहातील सगळ्या मान्यवरांचे आभार व्यक्त करणं हे मी माझं पहिलं कर्तव्य समजतो. डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर रिसर्च अँड ट्रेनिंग इन्स्टिट्यूट बार्टी पुणे यांनी ही परिषद आयोजित करण्यासाठी एक आपला लॉयन शेअर दिला. मोठं काम केलं त्यांनी, त्यासाठी मी त्यांचे हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. त्यानंतर फेडरेशन ऑफ ऑर्गनायझेशन्स फॉर सोशल जस्टिस, सेक्युलरिझम अँड डेमोक्रेसी या नागपुरातल्या संघटनेच्या फेडरेशनचा आणि त्यांच्या सगळ्या पदाधिकाऱ्यांचा मी हार्दिक आभारी आहे. परिषद आयोजित करण्यामागे त्यांचेही खूप कष्ट आहेत. ही परिषद आयोजित करण्यासाठी डॉक्टर प्रशांत नारनवरे सर, आयुक्त समाज कल्याण महाराष्ट्र शासन, त्यानंतर धम्मज्योती गजभिये साहेब, महासंचालक बार्टी, आणि डॉक्टर सिद्धार्थ गायकवाड सर, उप आयुक्त समाज कल्याण विभाग, या तिन्ही व्यक्तींचे मी हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. त्यांच्याशिवाय ही परिषद पूर्ण झाली नसती. त्याचप्रमाणे ही परिषदच खऱ्या अर्थाने फ्रेम केली डॉक्टर सुखदेव थोरात सर. त्यांची ही आयडिया होती. परिषदेचा विषय वेगळा होता आधी, पण म्हणजे ज्वलंत प्रश्नांचा विचार करून त्यांनी या परिषदेचा विषय बदलवला आणि ही परिषद आयोजित केली. मला असं वाटते त्याची नितांत गरज होती आणि ती त्यांनी पूर्ण केली. आणि आज आपण पाहता की शेवटपर्यंत ते आपल्यासोबत आपल्याला मार्गदर्शन करत आहेत. ही एक मोठी गोष्ट आहे. मी त्यांचे हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. पहिल्या सत्राचं अध्यक्षपद डॉक्टर अनवर सिद्दीकी, अध्यक्ष जमाते इस्लाम यांनी स्वीकारलं. त्यांचे मी हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. या सत्राला खरं म्हणजे डॉक्टर अवंती रमैया सर, डॉक्टर संजय दाभाडे सर आणि माननीय दीनानाथ वाघमारे सर यांनी खरं म्हणजे इनरिच केलं, खरं आम्हाला एज्युकेट केलं. या सगळ्यांचे आभार व्यक्त करणं मी माझं कर्तव्य समजतो. दुसऱ्या सत्राचं अध्यक्षपद माननीय दिलीप खोडके सर, जिल्हाध्यक्ष मराठा सेवा संघ यांनी भूषवलं. आणि या सत्रामध्ये ॲडव्होकेट फिरोज मिर्झा साहेब आणि माननीय अरुण गाडे सर यांनी फार चांगलं प्रेझेंटेशन केलं. त्यासाठी मी या तिघांचेही हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. तिसरं सत्र याची अध्यक्षता डॉक्टर सच्चिदानंद दारुंडे, जनरल सेक्रेटरी महाराष्ट्र ऑफिसर्स फोरम यांनी भूषविलं. आणि या सत्रामध्ये डॉक्टर सतीश देशपांडे साहेब यांनी ऑनलाईन प्रेझेंटेशन केलं. मी या उभयतांचे हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. महिलांच्या समस्येवरील सत्र होतं. माननीय कल्पना मेश्राम मॅडम यांनी त्यांचं अध्यक्षता केली. आणि या सत्रामध्ये ऑनलाईन प्रेझेंटेशन माननीय सुभासिनी अली, खरं म्हणजे सरांच्या आणि थोरात मॅडमच्या कॉन्टॅक्टमुळे एवढी मोठी व्यक्ती आपल्यासमोर आज प्रेझेंटेशन करून गेली. आपल्यासाठी फार भूषणावह गोष्ट आहे नागपूरसाठी. मी डॉक्टर विमल थोरात मॅडम, डॉक्टर सुभासिनी अली सर यांचे हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. तिसरं सत्र आर्थिकदृष्ट्या दुर्बल घटकांच्या आरक्षणाच्या समस्या यावरचं होतं. आणि राष्ट्रीय ओबीसी महिला महासंघाच्या अध्यक्षा मान्य सुषमा भट मॅडम यांनी त्याची अध्यक्षता केली. हे सत्र डॉक्टर मोहन गोपाळ सर, माजी डायरेक्टर NLSIU बँगलोर आणि डॉक्टर दिशा वाडेकर मॅम, सर्वोच्च न्यायालय दिल्ली या दोन्ही मान्यवरांनी ऑनलाईन प्रेझेंटेशन केलं आणि फार चांगलं प्रेझेंटेशन केलं. मी त्यासाठी त्यांचे आभार व्यक्त करतो. नंतरचं सत्र होतं भेदभाव गटासाठीचे धोरण. यासाठी डॉक्टर अनुराग भास्कर सर, सहाय्यक प्राध्यापक, जिंदाल ग्लोबल लॉ स्कूल, आणि त्याचप्रमाणे डॉक्टर अमित थोरात सर, सेंटर फॉर द स्टडी ऑफ रिजनल डेव्हलपमेंट, JNU नवी दिल्ली. थोरात सर या सत्रासाठी आपल्या सोबत सभागृहात आलेत. खरं म्हणजे ते खूप बिझी होते, पण तरीसुद्धा ते आलेत. यासाठी मी त्यांचे हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करतो. आणि या सत्राला खरं म्हणजे समारोपीय सत्रांमध्ये थोरात सरांनी फार चांगलं प्रेझेंटेशन केलं. नेमकं आपण काय केलं पाहिजे, नेमके आपल्यावर कुठले आघात होत आहेत याविषयी भाष्य केलं. आणि खरं म्हणजे आपल्याला सचेत केलं की असं होऊ शकतं, आपण काय करायला पाहिजे. मला असं वाटतं लोक बोलून खूप जातात, अनेक वेळा आपण ऐकतो त्यांना, पण हे जे त्यांचं बोलणं होतं एक अर्ध्या तासाचं, हे बोलणं खरं म्हणजे दिशादर्शक होतं. तर आपली संख्या जरी कमी असली तरी आपण हे त्यांचं जे प्रेझेंटेशन आहे हे स्प्रेडअप केलं पाहिजे समाजामध्ये, कारण तोच एक मार्ग आता आपल्याला दिसतो. त्याशिवाय दुसरा मार्ग तर मला तरी दिसत नाही. या सगळ्या परिषदेसाठी आम्हाला हॉल उपलब्ध करून दिला तर डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर स्मारक समितीचा आम्ही आभार व्यक्त केलेच पाहिजे. तंत्रज्ञ जे आहेत, म्हणजे एकाच दिवशी 2 कार्यक्रम करण्याची जी किमया आहे त्यांची, ती खरं म्हणजे फारच प्रभावित करण्यासाठी सारखी आहे आपल्याला. तर त्यांचे आभार व्यक्त करतो. आणि तंत्रज्ञ गौतम इथे आहेत, त्यांनी शेवटपर्यंत आम्हाला साथ दिली, त्यांचेही आभार व्यक्त करतो. याच्यामध्ये फेडरेशनचे जे पदाधिकारी आहेत, डॉक्टर अनवर सिद्दीकी, डॉक्टर नुरलामीन ख्वाजा, ॲडव्होकेट फिरदोस मिर्झा, डॉक्टर विमल थोरात, मान्य दिलीप खोडके, मान्य प्रदीप नगरारे साहेब,
कृपया जाऊ नये कुणी. आपण एक फोटोग्राफ्स घेतोय, कृपया जाऊ नये कुणी. 1-2 मिनिटात एक फोटोग्राफ्स घेतोय सर्वांचा, कृपया बसावं.
मान्य सुषमा भड, डॉक्टर अशोक उरकुडे, मान्य शिवदास वासे, मान्य अरुण गाडे साहेब, मान्य छाया खोब्रागडे, मान्य विलास भोंगाडे, मान्य किशोर खांडेकर, मान्य कल्पना मेश्राम, मान्य संजय शेंडे, मान्य राहुल परुळकर, डॉक्टर त्रिलोक हजारे सर यांचे विशेष आभार. ही परिषद खऱ्या अर्थाने त्यांनी सगळ्या खांद्यावर, त्यांचा जो भार आहे त्यांच्या खांद्यावर होता, आणि म्हणून या सगळ्यांचे आभार व्यक्त करतो. आणि जर समजा कोणी सुटलं असेल यातून, होऊ शकते,
डॉक्टर प्राध्यापक गौतम कांबळे यांचं मी आभार मानतो आहे.
जे आभार मानतात त्यांचे सुद्धा आभार मानले पाहिजेत. हे 2 व्यक्ती, हजारे आणि गौतम कांबळे आणि विद्या, ह्यांनी फार लागोपाठ काम केलेलं आहे. आणि अगदी वेळ कमी असताना हे मेमोंटो बनवणं, ते कॉईनचं स्टँड बनवणं आणि बाकी हे सर्व इतकं मोठं काम, हे तर त्या दोघांचे आपण आभार मानले पाहिजेत. टाळ्या द्या त्यांच्याकरता. त्यांची इच्छा आहे की आपल्या सर्वांसोबत एक फोटो घ्यावा.
चला,
आतापर्यंत सर्व इथे मोठा हे आहे.
आतापर्यंत आपण खाली बसला होता, आता सर्वांनी डायसवर यावं, उभे राहावं आणि आपण एक फोटो काढू. म्हणजे डायसचाही अनुभव घ्यायला पाहिजे. कृपया सर्वांनी डायसवर यावं.
आणि फोटोग्राफर भूपेश यांचे हार्दिक आभार. सॉरी, राहिलं होतं.